The collapse of the Ruran khaganate in 552 AD sent shockwaves across the vast expanse of the Eurasian steppes, triggering one of the most significant population movements in early medieval history. When Bumin Khan's Gokturks shattered the Ruran confederation that had dominated Mongolia for over a century, the defeated tribes faced a stark choice: submit to their conquerors or flee westward into the unknown territories beyond the Altai Mountains. Among those who chose exile were the groups that would eventually coalesce into the confederation known to history as the Avars. The Ruran Khaganate, established around 402 AD by Shelan Khan, had controlled the Mongolian steppes through a complex system of tribal alliances and military might. Their society was stratified, with the ruling Ruran clan at the apex, followed by various subordinate tribal groups who provided military service in exchange for protection and a share of tribute from sedentary populations. The Khaganate's military machine relied heavily on heavily armoured cavalry, sophisticated siege techniques learned from Chinese sources, and the organisational capabilities that allowed them to field armies numbering in the tens of thousands. When this system crumbled under Gokturk pressure, the surviving elements carried these military traditions westward. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in the Altai region and western Mongolia suggests that the Proto-Avar groups maintained many Ruran material culture elements during their initial westward migration. Stirrups, composite bows reinforced with the bone plates, and distinctive belt fittings bearing pseudo-runic inscriptions have been discovered in sites dating to the mid-6th century, creating a material trail that historians can follow across the steppes. These artifacts demonstrate continuity with Ruran craftsmanship while showing gradual adaptation to new environments and influences encountered during the migration. The journey westward was neither swift nor direct. Contemporary Chinese sources, particularly the Zhushu and Suishu chronicles, describe multiple waves of refugees fleeing the Gokturk conquest. These groups did not move as a unified mass, but rather as separate tribal confederations, each led by their own khans or chiefs who claimed legitimacy through real or fabricated connections to the fallen Ruran royal house. The migration routes took them through the Dzungarian Gate, that crucial passage between the Altai and Tian Shan mountain ranges that had served as a highway for nomadic movements for millennia. As these migrating groups moved westward, they encountered and absorbed other displaced populations. The steppes north of the Caspian Sea were already home to various Turkic and Hunnic remnant groups, descendants of Attila's confederation who had maintained semi-nomadic lifestyles in the region. The Proto-Avars demonstrated remarkable adaptability in incorporating these populations, adopting useful military techniques and technologies while maintaining their core organisational structure inherited from the Ruran period. The first concrete mention of the Avars in European sources appears in the works of Menander Protector, who describes their arrival at the borders of the Byzantine Empire around 558 AD. His account, preserved in fragments, describes a delegation of Avar envoys who approached Justinian I with offers of military service in exchange for territory and tribute. These envoys, according to Menander, wore silk robes and carried curved swords, presenting themselves as representatives of a mighty people who had travelled from the distant lands beyond the Caspian Sea. Byzantine chroniclers were initially uncertain about the identity of these newcomers. The name Avar itself appears to have been adopted by the migrating confederation rather than representing their original tribal designation. Contemporary sources suggest that multiple tribal groups united under this banner, possibly taking the name from a prestigious clan within their ranks, or adopting it as a means of claiming legitimacy in their new environment. This practice of ethnogenesis through confederation was common among steppe peoples, where political identity often superseded strict ethnic boundaries. The pseudo-Avars theory, first proposed by Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus in his 10th century work De Administrando Imperio, has generated considerable scholarly debate. According to this theory, the true Avars remained in Asia, and were eventually conquered by the Gok Turks, while the groups that reached Europe were actually Var and Chuni tribes, who assumed the Avar name to enhance their prestige. Porphyrogenitus claimed that the Gok Turk Khagan had informed the Byzantine Emperor that these European Avars were impostors who had fled from Gok Turk territory. Modern historians remain divided on this question. Supporters of the pseudo-Avar theory point to linguistic evidence suggesting that the European Avars spoke a Turkic language, rather than the Mongolic language associated with the historical Ruran. They also note differences in burial customs and material culture between the Mongolian Ruran sites and early Avar archaeological finds in the Carpathian Basin. Additionally, Chinese sources described the real Avars as remaining in Mongolia and being incorporated into the Gok Turk Confederation. However, critics of this theory argue that the linguistic and cultural differences can be explained by the natural evolution that occurs during long-distance migration and the incorporation of various Turkic groups during the westward journey. They contend that the core leadership of the European Avars likely did descend from Ruran nobility, even if the bulk of their followers came from diverse tribal backgrounds. The adoption of Turkic linguistic elements and customs would have been a natural consequence of their prolonged residence in Turkic-dominated territories during their migration. Recent archaeological discoveries have added new dimensions to this debate. Excavations at Avar period sites in Hungary have revealed burial practices that show both Mongolian and Turkic influences, suggesting a complex cultural synthesis rather than a simple ethnic replacement. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from early Avar cemeteries indicates a population with mixed East Asian and Central Asian ancestry, consistent with a migration that incorporated multiple ethnic groups along its route. The social structure that the Avars brought to Europe reflected their steppe origins, while showing adaptations developed during their westward journey. At the apex stood the Khagan, a title borrowed from Ruran usage that denoted supreme authority over the Confederation. Below the Khagan were various ranks of tribal leaders, including the Tarkans, who commanded specific military units, and the Tuduns, who administered tribute collection from subject populations. This hierarchical system allowed for effective command and control over large territories while maintaining the flexibility necessary for nomadic warfare. The Avar military organisation retained many elements from their Ruran heritage while incorporating innovations learned during their migration. Heavy cavalry remained the core of their fighting force, with warriors wearing lamella armour constructed from small metal or leather plates laced together with leather thongs. These armoured horsemen wielded composite bows capable of penetrating enemy armour at ranges exceeding 300 metres, while also carrying lances for close combat and curved sabres for melee fighting. The Avars' siege warfare capabilities set them apart from other contemporary nomadic groups. Unlike many steppe peoples who struggled against fortified positions, the Avars demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of siege engines and tactics. They employed torsion catapults, battering rams, and movable siege towers that could be quickly assembled from prefabricated components. This expertise likely derived from their Ruran ancestors' conflicts with Chinese fortifications, enhanced by knowledge gained from captured Byzantine and Frankish engineers during their European campaigns. Infantry played a supporting but important role in Avar armies. Foot soldiers, drawn primarily from subject Slavic populations, served as garrison troops, siege specialists, and support personnel for the cavalry formations. These infantry units used spears, axes, and shields in the Germanic fashion, though they also adopted some steppe weapons like the composite bow. The integration of infantry and cavalry in Avar military doctrine demonstrated their adaptability and willingness to modify traditional steppe tactics to suit European conditions. The Avar Confederation's administrative system reflected their nomadic origins while showing remarkable sophistication in managing sedentary populations. They maintained the steppe tradition of decimal organisation, structuring their military units in groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. This system facilitated rapid mobilization and deployment while ensuring clear chains of command during campaigns. Tribute collection from subject peoples followed patterns established during their Asian period, but adapted to European conditions. Rather than simply extracting goods and livestock, the Avars developed systems for managing agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade networks. They established administrative centers at strategic locations, often fortified sites that could serve as both military bases and economic hubs for their territories. The role of shamanism in early Avar society provides another link to their steppe origins. Archaeological evidence suggests that Avar religious practices initially centered on traditional Tengrist beliefs, with shamans serving as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. Burial goods from early Avar graves include bronze mirrors, horse bits, and animal-shaped ornaments that reflect shamanistic symbolism. However, the Avars showed pragmatic flexibility in religious matters, gradually adopting Christian elements as they established closer relationships with Byzantine and Frankish neighbours. Women held significant positions within Avar society, reflecting steppe traditions that differed markedly from contemporary European practices. High-status Avar women were buried with weapons, horse gear, and elaborate jewellery that indicated their important social roles. Some female burials contain items suggesting involvement in religious ceremonies or diplomatic activities, while others show evidence of participation in military campaigns. This relatively elevated status of women represented another distinctive feature that the Avars carried from their Asian homeland into their European territories. The Avars' arrival in Europe around 558 AD marked the beginning of their transformation from displaced refugees to masters of a powerful confederation that would dominate the Carpathian Basin for over 2 centuries. Their success in establishing this dominance stemmed largely from the military, administrative, and social traditions they had preserved and adapted during their long journey from the collapsed Eurasian khaganate. These traditions, forged in the harsh environment of the Mongolian steppes and refined through decades of migration and warfare, would prove remarkably effective in the very different landscape of early medieval Europe. The dust clouds that marked the Avar Confederation's arrival at the Byzantine frontier in 558 AD carried with them the accumulated military expertise of generations of steppe warfare. Emperor Justinian first, then, in the twilight years of his reign, received reports from his Danubian commanders describing an impressive delegation approaching Constantinople under banners bearing unfamiliar symbols. The Avar envoys, led by a chieftain named Kandich, presented themselves at the imperial court with the calculated confidence of seasoned negotiators who understood the delicate balance of power along the empire's northern borders. Justinian's initial reception of the Avar embassy reflected the pragmatic realpolitik that had characterized his long reign. The emperor, despite his advanced age, immediately grasped the strategic potential of these newcomers. His advisors, including the experienced general Belisarius, recognized that the Avars possessed exactly the type of mobile striking force that could address several pressing Byzantine concerns simultaneously. The empire's resources were stretched thin across multiple frontiers, with ongoing conflicts in Italy against the Ostrogoths and persistent threats from Sassanid Persia in the east. The prospect of employing Avar cavalry against troublesome neighbours offered an attractive alternative to deploying expensive imperial armies. The formal treaty negotiations between Kandich's delegation and Byzantine officials took place in the Great Palace, where the Avars demonstrated their diplomatic sophistication. Unlike the crude barbarian chieftains that Byzantine chroniclers often described, the Avar negotiators displayed intimate knowledge of imperial administrative procedures and territorial arrangements. They requested not merely payment for military services, but specific grants of territory along the Danube frontier, annual tribute payments calculated in gold solida, and formal recognition of their authority over any peoples they might conquer during their campaigns on Byzantium's behalf. Justinian's agreement to these terms represented a calculated gamble that would have far-reaching consequences for the balance of power in southeastern Europe. The emperor granted the Avars an annual subsidy of 80,000 gold pieces, a substantial sum that reflected both their perceived military value and the empire's desperate need for reliable allies. More significantly, the treaty established the precedent for Avar territorial expansion under Byzantine auspices, effectively legitimizing their future conquests in the Carpathian Basin. The Avars' first military operations as Byzantine allies targeted the Kutrigur Bulgars, a Turkic confederation that had been raiding imperial territories south of the Danube. The campaign, launched in late 558 AD, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of Avar military tactics against opponents unprepared for their sophisticated combined arms approach. Avar heavy cavalry, supported by auxiliary troops drawn from recently subjugated Slavic tribes, struck the Kutrigur settlements along the Dniester River with methodical precision. The Kutrigur leader Zabergan, who had previously conducted successful raids deep into Byzantine territory, found his forces completely outmatched by Avar tactical flexibility. Where Zabergan's warriors relied primarily on traditional steppe archery and light cavalry charges, the Avars employed coordinated attacks combining heavy cavalry, infantry support and siege equipment. Their lamella-armoured horsemen could absorb Kutrigur arrow volleys while closing to lance range, while their infantry formations prevented enemy attempts to outflank the cavalry charges. The systematic nature of the Avar conquest revealed organisational capabilities that impressed even experienced Byzantine observers. Rather than simply defeating Kutrigur armies in battle, the Avars implemented comprehensive strategies for territorial occupation and population control. They established fortified camps at strategic river crossings and mountain passes, ensuring that defeated enemies could not regroup or receive external assistance. Captured Kutrigur warriors faced a stark choice: integration into Avar military units as auxiliary troops or execution. Most chose integration, swelling Avar ranks with experienced fighters familiar with local terrain and conditions. The success against the Kutrigurs opened the path for Avar expansion into the Carpathian Basin, where numerous Slavic tribes had established agricultural settlements during the previous century. These Slavic communities, descendants of earlier migrants from the Pripet marshes and Upper Dnieper regions, had developed sophisticated farming techniques adapted to the fertile river valleys of modern-day Hungary and Slovakia. Their settlements, typically consisting of sunken-floor houses clustered around fortified hilltops called grads, provided the Avars with both agricultural resources and skilled craftsmen essential for maintaining their military equipment. The Avar approach to Slavic subjugation differed markedly from their treatment of nomadic rivals like the Kutrigurs. Rather than attempting wholesale destruction or displacement, they implemented a systematic tributary system that preserved existing social structures while imposing Avar political control. Slavic tribal leaders who submitted willingly retained their positions as local administrators under Avar oversight, while those who resisted faced complete replacement by Avar-appointed officials. Archaeological evidence from sites like Devinska Nova Ves in Slovakia reveals the material impact of Avar dominance on Slavic communities. Pre-Avar Slavic settlements show relatively egalitarian distributions of goods and limited evidence of social stratification. After Avar conquest, the same sites display clear hierarchical distinctions, with certain households possessing luxury items like Byzantine silk, silver jewellery, and high-quality weapons, while others contain only basic pottery and agricultural tools. This transformation reflects the Avars' success in co-opting Slavic elites while extracting tribute from the broader population. The tribute system established by the Avars demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its adaptation to local conditions and resources. In agricultural regions, tribute consisted primarily of grain, livestock, and craft products. collected according to seasonal cycles that maximise production without destroying the economic base. Slavic metal workers provided weapons, horse gear, and decorative items essential for maintaining Avar military effectiveness, while textile workers produced the clothing and banners that displayed Avar status and authority. Avar military campaigns against the Gepids began in earnest around 562 AD, marking a significant escalation in their territorial ambitions. The Gepid kingdom, established in the Tisa River Valley under King Thurisind, controlled some of the most fertile agricultural land in the Carpathian Basin, along with important trade routes connecting the Black Sea region with Central Europe. Unlike the relatively decentralized Slavic tribes, the Gepids possessed a unified military command structure and extensive experience fighting both Byzantine and Lombard enemies. King Thurisind's initial response to Avar expansion involved diplomatic outreach to potential allies, particularly the Lombard kingdom under Alboin. The Gepid-Lombard rivalry, which had simmered for decades over control of Pannonian territories, temporarily gave way to discussions of joint action against the Avar threat. However, these negotiations foundered on mutual distrust and conflicting territorial claims, leaving both Germanic kingdoms vulnerable to Avar divide-and-conquer tactics. The first major engagement between Avar and Gepid forces occurred near the confluence of the Tisa and Maros rivers, where Gepid cavalry attempted to halt an Avar raiding column returning from Byzantine territory with substantial plunder. The battle demonstrated the technological and tactical advantages that gave the Avars decisive superiority over their Germanic opponents. Gepid warriors, equipped with spears, shields and mail shirts in the traditional Germanic fashion, proved unable to counter the Avars' combination of heavy cavalry and archery. Avar composite bows, with their effective range of over 300 metres, allowed them to inflict casualties on Gepid formations before close combat began. When the Gepids attempted cavalry charges to close the distance, they encountered Avar heavy cavalry, whose lamellar armour provided superior protection against Germanic weapons. The curved sabres favoured by Avar warriors proved particularly effective against mail armour, as their slashing attacks could find gaps between metal rings more easily than straight-bladed Germanic swords. The systematic reduction of Gepid strongholds revealed another dimension of Avar military capabilities. Gepid fortifications, typically consisting of wooden palisades reinforced with earthworks, offered little resistance to Avar siege techniques learned during their ancestors' conflicts with Chinese cities. Avar engineers constructed torsion catapults capable of hurling stones weighing over 50 kilograms, while their siege towers allowed attackers to approach fortified walls under cover from defensive archery. The siege of Sirmium in 567 AD marked the climax of the Avar-Gepid conflict and demonstrated the Avars' growing independence from Byzantine oversight. Sirmium, a former Roman provincial capital that had served as the Gepid kingdom's primary fortress, controlled the crucial crossing point where the Sava River joins the Danube. Its capture would give the Avars complete control over the southeastern approaches to the Carpathian Basin, while eliminating the last major Gepid stronghold. The siege lasted nearly 6 months, during which the Avars displayed their mastery of both military engineering and psychological warfare. They constructed a double line of circumvallation around the city, preventing both escape and relief attempts while systematically reducing the fortifications with catapult bombardment. Simultaneously, they negotiated with Gepid nobles inside the city, offering favourable terms for surrender while threatening complete destruction for continued resistance. King Cunimund, who had succeeded his father Thurisind during the siege, attempted several sorties to break the Avar encirclement. These attacks, launched primarily at night to minimise casualties from Avar archery, achieved temporary tactical successes but failed to alter the strategic situation. Avar discipline and organisation proved superior to Gepid individual heroism, as their decimal command structure allowed rapid response to enemy initiatives while maintaining overall siege operations. The fall of Sirmium eliminated Gepid power in the Carpathian Basin and established the Avars as the dominant force in the region. The terms imposed on the surviving Gepid population reflected Avar administrative practices developed during their earlier conquests. Gepid warriors who submitted received integration into Avar military units, though in subordinate roles that reflected their defeated status. Gepid craftsmen and farmers continued their previous occupations under Avar supervision, providing the technical skills necessary for maintaining the Confederation's military and economic strength. The Lombard kingdom under Alboin faced a strategic dilemma following the Gepid collapse. Lombard territories in Pannonia now shared extensive borders with Avar-controlled lands, creating numerous opportunities for conflict over grazing rights, trade routes, and territorial boundaries. Alboin's attempts to negotiate a stable frontier with the Avar Khagan met with limited success, as Avar demands for tribute and territorial concessions exceeded what the Lombard king could accept while maintaining his authority over his own nobles. Avar pressure on Lombard territories intensified throughout 567 and early 568 AD, taking forms ranging from cattle raids to full-scale military expeditions. The Avars demonstrated particular skill in exploiting Lombard internal divisions, offering support to disaffected nobles while simultaneously negotiating with Alboin's government. This dual approach created uncertainty within Lombard ruling circles about Avar intentions, while gradually weakening Lombard military effectiveness through constant low-level conflict. The tributary relationships established by the Avars during this period created the foundation for their long-term dominance in Central Europe. Unlike simple extraction of wealth through raiding, the Avar system provided sustainable revenue streams while maintaining the productive capacity of subject populations. Slavic agricultural communities provided grain and livestock according to regular schedules, while Germanic craftsmen contributed weapons and luxury goods that enhanced Avar prestige and military capability. The Avar administrative system adapted traditional steppe practices to the complex ethnic and economic landscape of the Carpathian Basin. Tribal leaders from subject peoples retained local authority under Avar oversight, creating a hierarchical structure that channeled resources upward, while maintaining social stability at the local level. This approach proved remarkably effective in managing diverse populations with different languages, customs, and economic systems. The establishment of Avar hegemony fundamentally altered the political geography of southeastern Europe. Where previously numerous independent tribes and kingdoms had competed for territory and resources, the Avar Confederation created a unified political entity capable of challenging both Byzantine and Frankish power. The tributary system provided the Avars with resources sufficient to maintain large military forces, while their strategic position in the Carpathian Basin gave them control over crucial trade routes connecting northern and southern Europe. The Lombard evacuation of Pannonia in 568 AD created a power vacuum that Bayern first exploited with characteristic strategic acumen. As Alboin's warriors departed for their conquest of northern Italy, they left behind not merely territory, but an entire infrastructure of settlements, fortifications, and agricultural systems that the Avars could immediately occupy and exploit. Bayern, who had assumed leadership of the Confederation following Candic's death around 565 AD, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of territorial consolidation that went far beyond simple military occupation. The new Khagan's first priority involved securing the abandoned Lombard strongholds along the Danube frontier. These fortifications, originally constructed during the Roman period and subsequently modified by successive Germanic occupants, provided ready-made administrative centres for Avar territorial control. The fortress at Aquincum, with its commanding position overlooking the Danube bend, became Bayern's primary residence and the ceremonial centre of the emerging khaganate. Archaeological excavations at the site have revealed extensive modifications undertaken during the early Avar period, including the construction of new residential quarters designed to accommodate both the Khagan's court and the administrative apparatus necessary for governing the expanding confederation. Bayan's consolidation strategy revealed a remarkable synthesis of steppe nomadic traditions with the administrative requirements of ruling sedentary populations. Rather than attempting to impose a uniform system across all conquered territories, he developed a flexible framework that adapted to local conditions while maintaining centralized control over military and economic resources. This approach reflected lessons learned during the Confederation's westward migration, where successful integration of diverse tribal groups had required pragmatic accommodation of different customs and social structures. The administrative structure that emerged during Bayan's reign represented a sophisticated evolution of traditional steppe governance models. At the apex stood the Khagan himself, whose authority derived from a combination of military success, diplomatic skill, and claimed descent from the Roran royal house. Bayan's court, established at Aquincum, included not only traditional steppe advisors but also captured Byzantine administrators, Gepid nobles who had submitted after their kingdom's collapse, and Slavic chieftains who had proven their loyalty through military service. The dual leadership system that characterized mature Avar administration emerged gradually during the 570s as territorial expansion created administrative challenges beyond the capacity of traditional steppe governance methods. While the Khagan retained supreme authority over military affairs and foreign policy, day-to-day administration of conquered territories fell increasingly to officials bearing the title Tudun. These administrators, drawn from both Avar nobility and capable individuals from subject populations, served as the Khagan's representatives in specific regions while maintaining responsibility for tribute collection, military recruitment, and dispute resolution. The Tudun system demonstrated remarkable flexibility in its adaptation to local conditions throughout the Carpathian Basin. In predominantly Slavic agricultural regions, Tuduns typically established their headquarters at existing tribal centres, working through traditional Slavic leadership structures to maintain production and collect tribute. In areas with significant Germanic populations, Tuduns often occupied former royal residences or major fortifications, emphasizing their authority through visible displays of Avar military power. Along the Danube frontier, where contact with Byzantine territories required sophisticated diplomatic capabilities, Tuduns frequently possessed extensive experience in interstate negotiations and maintained staffs capable of conducting correspondence in Greek and Latin. The integration policies developed under Bayan's leadership reflected a pragmatic approach to managing the Confederation's increasingly diverse population. Rather than attempting cultural homogenization, Avar administrators encouraged the preservation of local customs and languages while requiring acknowledgement of Avar political supremacy and fulfillment of tributary obligations. This approach proved particularly effective in maintaining stability among Slavic agricultural communities, whose cooperation was essential for feeding the Confederation's military forces and supporting its expanding administrative apparatus. Slavic integration into Avar society occurred through multiple channels that reflected both voluntary association and administrative necessity. Slavic warriors who demonstrated exceptional skill in battle could earn promotion within Avar military units, eventually achieving positions of considerable authority within the Confederation's command structure. Archaeological evidence from Avar period cemeteries reveals the presence of individuals buried with mixed Slavic and Avar grave goods, suggesting successful cultural integration at the personal level. These burials, found at sites throughout the Carpathian Basin, typically contain Slavic pottery and agricultural tools, alongside Avar weapons and horse gear, indicating individuals who maintained connections to their original cultural background while adopting Avar military and social practices. The economic foundations of the Avar khaganate reflected both traditional steppe practices and adaptations necessitated by the Confederation's sedentary subjects. Tribute collection, the primary source of state revenue, operated according to sophisticated schedules that maximised extraction while maintaining the productive capacity of subject populations. Agricultural tribute consisted primarily of grain, livestock, and processed foods like cheese and preserved meat, collected according to seasonal cycles that allowed farmers to complete harvesting and food preparation before surrendering their obligations to avar collectors. The tribute system's sophistication extended to its accommodation of regional economic specializations throughout the Carpathian Basin. Communities located near iron ore deposits provided weapons, tools, and raw metal, while those in forested regions contributed timber for construction and fuel for metalworking. Settlements along major rivers specialized in fishing and river transport, providing both food and logistical support for avar military campaigns. This economic diversity allowed the khaganate to maintain military effectiveness, while reducing dependence on external trade for essential resources. Trade networks established under avar auspices connected the Carpathian Basin with markets throughout Europe and beyond. Avar merchants, operating under the protection of the khaganate's military forces, established regular trading relationships with Byzantine cities along the Danube, Frankish territories to the west, and Slavic settlements extending northward into modern-day Poland and Ukraine. These commercial connections provided access to luxury goods that enhanced avar prestige, while generating revenue through customs duties and trading privileges granted to foreign merchants. The adaptation of pastoral nomadism to the Carpathian Basin's environmental conditions required significant modifications to traditional steppe practices. The region's extensive forests and river systems offered different opportunities and challenges compared to the open grasslands of Central Asia. Avar herders developed techniques for managing livestock in partially forested terrain, utilizing natural clearings for grazing while employing controlled burning to create additional pasture land. River valleys provided excellent winter shelter for horses and cattle, while upland areas offered summer grazing that kept animals healthy and well fed throughout the year. The horse herds that form the foundation of avar military power required particularly careful management in their new environment. Avar horse breeding practices, inherited from their steppe ancestors, emphasized the production of sturdy, versatile animals capable of carrying armored warriors over long distances, while maintaining the speed and endurance necessary for traditional nomadic warfare. Archaeological analysis of horse remains from avar sites reveals animals averaging 14 hands in height, smaller than modern war horses but possessing the compact build and strong bones necessary for supporting heavy cavalry equipment. The integration of Germanic populations into avar society proceeded along different lines than Slavic assimilation, reflecting both cultural differences and the distinct circumstances of Germanic defeat and submission. Gephid nobles who had submitted after their kingdom's collapse retained certain privileges in recognition of their previous status, but their authority was strictly circumscribed by avar oversight. Germanic craftsmen, particularly metalworkers and jewelers, found their skills highly valued by avar elites, leading to the development of distinctive artistic styles that combined Germanic techniques with steppe motifs and Byzantine influences. The religious policies implemented during Bayan's reign demonstrated characteristic avar pragmatism in managing diverse belief systems among their subjects. While the avar elite maintained traditional Tengrist practices centered on sky worship and ancestral veneration, they showed remarkable tolerance for Christian observance among their Germanic and some Slavic subjects. This religious flexibility served important political purposes, as it reduced potential sources of resistance while facilitating diplomatic relationships with Christian neighbours like Byzantium and the Frankish kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from avar burial sites reveals the complex religious synthesis that emerged during this period. Elite avar graves contain traditional steppe grave goods, including horse sacrifices, weapons, and shamanic symbols. but also include Christian crosses and other religious artifacts that suggest either personal conversion or diplomatic considerations. The presence of Christian symbols in Avar elite burials likely reflects the practical necessities of ruling predominantly Christian populations, rather than genuine religious conversion, as traditional Tengrist elements continue to dominate the archaeological record throughout the Avar period. The military organisation of the mature Avar khaganate combined traditional steppe cavalry tactics with innovations developed through contact with Byzantine and Germanic military practices. The core of Avar military strength remained the heavily armoured cavalry units, composed of professional warriors drawn primarily from Avar tribal groups. These horsemen wore lamella armour constructed from small metal plates laced together with leather cords, providing excellent protection while maintaining the flexibility necessary for mounted archery. Their primary weapons included composite bows capable of penetrating mail armour at ranges exceeding 200 metres, long lances for cavalry charges, and curved sabres designed for slashing attacks against both mounted and infantry opponents. The integration of subject populations into Avar military forces created a complex hierarchy that reflected both military effectiveness and political considerations. Slavic infantry units, organised according to traditional tribal structures but equipped with standardised weapons provided by Avar armories, served primarily as garrison forces and siege specialists. These foot soldiers proved particularly valuable during sieges, where their knowledge of local terrain and construction techniques complemented Avar engineering capabilities. Germanic warriors, when they chose to serve rather than flee to other kingdoms, typically joined existing Avar cavalry units as individual fighters rather than maintaining separate ethnic formations. The siege warfare capabilities that distinguished the Avars from other contemporary nomadic groups underwent further development during Bayan's reign. Avar engineers perfected the construction of Torsian catapults capable of hurling stones weighing up to 75 kilograms over distances of 300 meters, while their siege towers incorporated innovative features like adjustable ramps and protective mantlets that allowed attackers to approach fortified walls under cover. These technological advances reflected both inherited knowledge from the Eurasian period and continuous innovation driven by the practical challenges of conquering fortified positions throughout the Carpathian Basin. The diplomatic framework established by the Avar khaganate during this period reflected Bayan's sophisticated understanding of European power dynamics. Rather than relying solely on military intimidation, the Avars developed complex treaty relationships with neighbouring powers that provided mutual benefits while advancing Avar strategic interests. The ongoing relationship with Byzantium, initially established during Justinian's reign, evolved into a partnership that gave the Avars access to Byzantine markets and diplomatic support in exchange for military assistance against common enemies like the Sassanid Persians and various Slavic tribes that threatened imperial territories. The administrative innovations developed during Bayan's consolidation of power created institutional foundations that would support Avar dominance in Central Europe for over 2 centuries. The combination of traditional steppe leadership practices with administrative techniques adapted from Byzantine and Germanic models produced a governmental system capable of managing territories extending from the Carpathian Mountains to the Adriatic Sea. This administrative sophistication, combined with military superiority and economic prosperity generated through tribute and trade, established the Avar khaganate as one of the most powerful political entities in early medieval Europe. The dawn of the 7th century found the Avar khaganate at the zenith of its territorial expansion, with Bayan I's successors inheriting a confederation that stretched from the Carpathian Mountains to the shores of the Adriatic Sea. The administrative and military foundations established during the previous decades now supported increasingly ambitious campaigns that would test the limits of Avar power against the most formidable opponents in contemporary Europe. The death of Bayan around 602 AD marked not an end but a transformation. as the khaganate's leadership passed to a new generation of rulers who viewed the wealthy Byzantine provinces south of the Danube as the natural next stage of Avar expansion. The systematic penetration of Byzantine territories began under the leadership of Bayan's immediate successor, whose name remains uncertain in the historical record but whose military campaigns demonstrated the full maturation of Avar's strategic capabilities. Unlike the opportunistic raids that had characterized earlier Avar-Byzantine interactions, these new offensives followed carefully coordinated plans designed to establish permanent Avar control over key strategic positions throughout the Balkans. The campaigns targeted specific objectives including major river crossings, mountain passes, and fortified cities that controlled regional trade networks and agricultural resources. The first major Avar offensive into Byzantine territory occurred in 602 AD, coinciding with the military rebellion that brought focus to the imperial throne in Constantinople. The timing was not coincidental, as Avar intelligence networks had provided detailed information about the empire's internal political crisis and the withdrawal of experienced troops from Danubian frontier positions to support various claimants to imperial power. Avar forces crossed the Danube at multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming the reduced Byzantine garrisons and establishing bridgeheads that would support sustained operations deep into imperial territory. The Avar approach to Balkan warfare demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the region's complex terrain and demographic composition. Rather than attempting to hold extensive territories with limited forces, they concentrated on capturing fortified positions that controlled communication routes and supply lines. The fortress city of Singidunum, located at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, became the primary target of the initial campaign due to its strategic importance as the gateway to the Central Balkans and its substantial warehouses filled with grain and military supplies intended for the frontier armies. The siege of Singidunum revealed the full extent of Avar siege warfare capabilities developed over 4 decades of European campaigning. Avar engineers constructed a complex system of earthworks and wooden fortifications that completely encircled the city, preventing both escape and relief while providing protected positions for their siege engines. The catapults employed during the siege represented significant improvements over earlier models, with torsion mechanisms capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing over 100 kilograms at ranges exceeding 400 meters. These massive engines, constructed from prefabricated components that could be quickly assembled at siege sites, proved capable of breaching the thick stone walls that had protected Roman cities for centuries. The psychological warfare tactics employed during the Singidunum siege demonstrated Avar understanding of the diverse population within Byzantine territories. Rather than simply starving the defenders into submission, Avar commanders offered specific terms to different ethnic groups within the city. Slavic inhabitants received promises of favourable treatment and integration into the Avar Confederation, while Greek administrators and military officers faced the prospect of execution or slavery if they continued resistance. These differentiated approaches created internal divisions within the besieged city that ultimately proved more effective than purely military pressure enforcing surrender. The fall of Singidunum after a siege lasting 3 months established patterns that would characterize Avar operations throughout the Balkans for the next 2 decades. Captured cities became administrative centers for Avar territorial control, with tuduns appointed to oversee tribute collection and military recruitment among the local population. The existing urban infrastructure remained largely intact, as the Avars recognized the economic value of maintaining commercial and craft production rather than simply extracting portable wealth through plunder. The integration of Balkan Slavic populations into the Avar Confederation proceeded along lines similar to earlier incorporations in the Carpathian Basin, but with important modifications reflecting the different political and economic conditions south of the Danube. Many Slavic communities in the Balkans had maintained greater independence from Byzantine control than their northern counterparts, developing autonomous political structures and military organizations that the Avars could co-opt rather than replace entirely. Slavic tribal leaders who demonstrated loyalty to Avar authority received confirmation of their local positions while accepting responsibility for tribute collection and military service. The military innovations that emerged during the Balkan campaigns reflected both Avar adaptability and their encounters with new tactical challenges presented by Byzantine defensive strategies. The adoption of stirrups, which had been gradually spreading westward from Central Asia during the 6th century, became universal among Avar heavy cavalry during this period. Archaeological evidence from burial sites dating to the early 7th century shows standardized stirrup designs that provided cavalrymen with significantly improved stability when using lances or drawing composite bows while mounted. The stirrup's impact on Avar military effectiveness extended beyond simple tactical advantages to fundamental changes in cavalry organisation and training. Stirrups allowed heavily armoured horsemen to deliver devastating lance charges without losing their seats, while also providing the stability necessary for accurate archery from horseback at full gallop. The combination of these capabilities created a new type of heavy cavalry that could function effectively as both shock troops and mounted archers, depending on tactical requirements. This versatility proved particularly valuable in the varied terrain of the Balkans, where open plains suitable for traditional steppe cavalry charges alternated with mountainous regions that required different tactical approaches. The development of specialized heavy cavalry techniques under Avar auspices influenced military practices throughout early medieval Europe. The characteristic Avar cavalry formation, consisting of heavily armoured lancers supported by mounted archers and light cavalry scouts, provided a template that would be adopted with modifications by Byzantine, Frankish, and later medieval armies. The effectiveness of this combined arms approach stemmed from its flexibility in responding to different tactical situations, while maintaining the striking power necessary to break enemy formations through concentrated attacks. The siege warfare innovations developed during the Balkan campaigns represented equally significant military advances. Avar engineers perfected the construction of mobile siege towers that could be assembled from standardized components and moved into position using teams of oxen or horses. These towers, standing up to 15 meters in height, incorporated multiple levels for different types of attackers, with archers on the upper platforms providing covering fire, while assault troops used the lower levels to approach and attack defensive walls. The towers also featured adjustable bridges that could be lowered onto enemy fortifications, allowing direct assault on wall-mounted defenders. The coordination required for effective siege operations demonstrated the sophisticated command and control capabilities that distinguished Avar military organisation from that of their contemporaries. Siege commanders maintained detailed schedules coordinating the activities of catapult crews, tower operators, tunnel diggers, and assault troops while simultaneously managing supply lines that kept thousands of warriors and their horses fed during prolonged operations. This logistical sophistication reflected the administrative expertise developed during decades of managing the diverse populations within the Avar Confederation. The diplomatic dimensions of Avar expansion into the Balkans revealed the khaganate's growing sophistication in managing relationships with multiple major powers simultaneously. While conducting military operations against Byzantine territories, Avar diplomats maintained communication with Sassanid Persia, exploring possibilities for coordinated action against their common Byzantine enemy. These negotiations, conducted through intermediaries and diplomatic missions that crossed the Black Sea via Crimean ports, established the foundation for the Grand Alliance that would culminate in the Siege of Constantinople in 626 AD. The Persian connection provided the Avars with access to military technologies and techniques that complemented their existing capabilities. Sassanid expertise in siege warfare, developed through centuries of conflict with Roman and Byzantine forces, included advanced knowledge of undermining techniques and the construction of siege engines specifically designed for attacking stone fortifications. The exchange of technical knowledge between Avar and Persian engineers resulted in hybrid designs that combined the mobility advantages of traditional steppe siege equipment with the destructive power of Persian heavy catapults. The relationship with Frankish kingdoms during this period reflected the complex balance of power that characterized early 7th century European politics. While the Avars maintained generally hostile relations with the Merovingian kingdoms due to territorial disputes along their western borders, they also recognized the value of preventing a grand anti-Avar coalition that might include both Frankish and Byzantine forces. Avar diplomatic initiatives toward the Franks typically involved offers of military cooperation against common enemies, particularly the Lombards in northern Italy, combined with proposals for territorial agreements that would establish stable frontiers between Avar and Frankish spheres of influence. The Frankish response to Avar diplomatic overtures varied according to the internal political situation within the Merovingian kingdoms and the specific interests of individual rulers. King Clothar II, who achieved temporary reunification of the Frankish realms in 613 AD, initially showed interest in coordinating with the Avars against Byzantine positions in Istria and Dalmatia. However, these negotiations foundered on disagreements over territorial divisions and mutual suspicions about long-term intentions. The Franks remained concerned about Avar expansion westward, while the Avars questioned Frankish commitment to sustained military cooperation given their history of internal conflicts. The economic foundations supporting Avar military expansion during this period reflected the maturation of tribute systems established throughout the Confederation's territories. The wealth extracted from Slavic agricultural communities, Germanic craft centres, and captured Byzantine cities provided the resources necessary to maintain large military forces in the field for extended campaigns. Tribute collection had evolved beyond simple extraction of goods to include specialized production of military equipment, with subject populations required to provide specific quantities of weapons, armor, and horse gear according to standardized specifications. The standardization of military equipment throughout Avar forces represented a significant organizational achievement that enhanced both combat effectiveness and logistical efficiency. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites reveals remarkably consistent designs for arrowheads, lance points, and armor components, indicating centralized production systems capable of equipping thousands of warriors with identical gear. This standardization allowed for simplified maintenance and repair procedures, while ensuring that all units possessed equipment of known quality and performance characteristics. The culmination of 2 decades of Balkan campaigning came with the Great Siege of Constantinople in 626 AD, an operation that represented the most ambitious military undertaking in Avar history. The siege resulted from extensive diplomatic and military preparations involving coordination between Avar forces approaching from the west, Sassanid armies advancing through Anatolia from the east, and Slavic naval forces operating in the Bosphorus. The complexity of this multi-front operation required unprecedented levels of strategic planning and interstate cooperation that demonstrated the Avar khaganate's evolution into a major European power capable of challenging the Byzantine Empire's very existence. The Avar approach to Constantinople involved forces numbering approximately 80,000 warriors, including the Confederation's elite heavy cavalry units, Slavic infantry formations, and specialized siege troops equipped with the most advanced engines available. The army's composition reflected the ethnic diversity of the Avar Confederation, with contingents drawn from throughout the Carpathian Basin and the recently conquered Balkan territories. Command structure remained firmly in Avar hands, but the integration of subject peoples into military operations had reached levels of sophistication that allowed effective coordination of diverse tactical traditions and fighting styles. The siege itself revealed both the strengths and limitations of Avar military capabilities when confronted with the massive fortifications and determined resistance of the Byzantine capital. The land-based assault on the city's western walls achieved initial successes, with Avar siege engines breaching sections of the outer fortifications and assault troops establishing footholds on the defensive walls. However, the failure of the coordinated naval assault in the Golden Horn, where Slavic vessels proved inadequate against Byzantine naval forces equipped with Greek fire, prevented the complete encirclement necessary for forcing the city's surrender. The ultimate failure of the Constantinople siege marked a turning point in Avar history, though its immediate consequences were less dramatic than later events would suggest. The withdrawal of Avar forces from the capital's vicinity did not represent a catastrophic military defeat, but rather a strategic recognition that the resources required for capturing such a heavily fortified position exceeded the Confederation's current capabilities. The Avar army remained intact and continued to control most of its Balkan conquests, while the experience gained during the siege provided valuable lessons for future military operations. The retreat from Constantinople's walls in August 626 AD forced the Avar leadership into a period of introspection and reorganization that would fundamentally reshape the Confederation's internal structure. The failure to capture the Byzantine capital, despite the massive resources committed to the siege, exposed critical weaknesses in Avar strategic planning and intertribal coordination that demanded immediate attention. The khagan who had led the siege, whose name appears in Byzantine sources as Bayan, but may have been a successor to the original Bayan, faced unprecedented challenges to his authority from tribal leaders who questioned the wisdom of committing so many warriors to a single, ultimately unsuccessful operation. The political crisis that emerged in the siege's aftermath manifested itself through a series of succession disputes and territorial rebellions that threatened to fragment the Confederation along ethnic and regional lines. Slavic tribal leaders in the southern Balkans, who had contributed substantial infantry forces to the Constantinople campaign, began asserting greater autonomy over their territories while reducing tribute payments to the khagan's court. Germanic nobles, particularly former Gepid aristocrats who had maintained positions within the Avar administrative hierarchy, saw an opportunity to reclaim some measure of independence by exploiting the apparent weakness of central authority. The resolution of these internal conflicts required a comprehensive restructuring of Avar political institutions that balanced the traditional authority of the khagan with the practical necessities of governing an increasingly diverse and territorially extensive confederation. The new system that emerged during the 630s established a more formalized hierarchy of regional administrators, with greater autonomy granted to local leaders in exchange for guaranteed tribute payments and military service obligations. This decentralization actually strengthened Avar control by reducing the administrative burden on the central government while creating stronger incentives for local cooperation. Archaeological evidence from major Avar centers during this period revealed significant changes in settlement patterns and material culture that reflect these political transformations. The khagan's primary residence, which had moved from a quincum to a new fortified complex near modern-day Budapest, underwent extensive expansion and modification during the 630s and 640s. Excavations have uncovered multiple phases of construction that incorporated Byzantine architectural techniques alongside traditional steppe building methods, creating a distinctive hybrid style that would characterize elite Avar architecture throughout the remainder of the Confederation's existence. The most striking feature of this architectural synthesis was the development of elaborate burial complexes that combined traditional steppe tumulus construction with Byzantine masonry techniques and Germanic metalworking traditions. The largest of these complexes, located approximately 20 kilometers southeast of the main khagan's residence, contains over 200 individual burial chambers arranged in concentric circles around a central mound that likely held the remains of a khagan or other high-ranking official. The construction techniques employed in these burials required coordination between craftsmen from multiple ethnic backgrounds, demonstrating the successful integration of diverse technical traditions under Avar patronage. The distinctive metalwork that emerged during this period represents one of the most remarkable achievements of Avar material culture, combining techniques and motifs drawn from across the Confederation's territorial extent. Avar goldsmiths developed sophisticated granulation and filigree techniques that created intricate decorative patterns on belt fittings, weapons, and jewellery. These pieces typically featured geometric designs that incorporated traditional steppe animal motifs, with Byzantine Christian symbols and Germanic interlace patterns, creating a unique artistic synthesis that reflected the Confederation's multicultural character. The production of these luxury metalwork items required access to raw materials from across Europe and beyond, indicating the existence of extensive trade networks that survived the political disruptions following the Constantinople siege. Gold likely came from Transylvanian mines, while silver was imported from Germanic territories to the west and Byzantine provinces to the south. The technical knowledge required for advanced metalworking techniques suggests the presence of specialist craftsmen who had received training in multiple traditions, possibly including individuals who had worked in Byzantine imperial workshops before being captured or recruited by Avar patrons. The standardization of burial practices throughout Avar territories during this period provides crucial evidence for understanding the Confederation's approach to cultural integration and social hierarchy. Elite Avar burials from the mid-7th century follow remarkably consistent patterns regardless of their geographic location, with the deceased typically interred alongside horses, weapons, and elaborate belt sets that indicated their social status and military achievements. These standardized practices created a unified Avar identity that transcended ethnic boundaries while accommodating local variations in grave goods and burial orientation. The horse burials that accompanied elite Avar interments reveal sophisticated understanding of equine breeding and management that had evolved considerably since the Confederation's arrival in Europe. Analysis of horse remains from 7th century Avar cemeteries indicates animals that average 15 hands in height, larger than their 6th century predecessors, and better adapted to the agricultural landscape of the Carpathian Basin. These horses possessed the sturdy build necessary for carrying heavily armoured warriors, while maintaining the speed and endurance required for traditional steppe warfare tactics. The evolution of Avar horse breeding practices reflected broader changes in the Confederation's relationship with its environment and subject populations. Slavic agricultural communities provided not only tribute in the form of grain and livestock, but also technical knowledge about animal husbandry adapted to Central European conditions. The integration of this knowledge with traditional steppe practices created hybrid breeding programs that produced horses superior to either tradition alone, demonstrating the practical benefits of cultural synthesis within the Avar Confederation. The role of Slavic populations within Avar society underwent significant evolution during this period of internal consolidation. While Slavs had initially served primarily as agricultural producers and auxiliary infantry, their increasing integration into Avar administrative and military structures created new opportunities for social advancement and cultural influence. Slavic nobles who demonstrated loyalty and competence could achieve positions of considerable authority within the Confederation's hierarchy, though they typically retained their Slavic cultural identity while adopting Avar political and military practices. The gradual cultural integration of Slavic populations manifested itself in various aspects of material culture and social organization throughout Avar territories. Pottery styles from mid-7th century sites show clear influences from Slavic ceramic traditions, with Avar potters adopting decorative techniques and vessel forms that had originated in Slavic communities. Similarly, agricultural practices in areas under direct Avar control incorporated Slavic innovations in crop rotation and soil management that increased productivity while reducing labour requirements. The linguistic evidence for Slavic-Avar cultural interaction remains limited due to the absence of written sources in either language from this period, but place names and personal names preserved in later sources suggest extensive linguistic borrowing in both directions. Avar administrative terminology appears to have influenced Slavic political vocabulary, while Slavic agricultural and craft terms entered Avar usage as the Confederation adapted to its sedentary environment. This linguistic synthesis paralleled broader patterns of cultural integration that strengthened rather than weakened the Confederation's internal cohesion. Religious practices within the Avar Confederation during this period reflected the same pragmatic approach to cultural diversity that characterized other aspects of internal policy. The Avar elite maintained traditional Tengris beliefs centered on sky worship and ancestral veneration, but they showed increasing accommodation of Christian practices among their subject populations. This religious flexibility served important political purposes by reducing potential sources of resistance, while facilitating diplomatic relationships with Christian neighbours. The archaeological evidence for Avar religious practices reveals a complex synthesis of beliefs and rituals that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. Elite burial sites contain traditional shamanistic grave goods, including bronze mirrors, horse bits decorated with animal motifs, and weapons that were believed to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. However, the same burials often include Christian crosses, Byzantine coins bearing religious imagery, and other artifacts that suggest either personal conversion or diplomatic considerations related to managing Christian subjects. The presence of Christian elements in Avar elite culture appears to have increased significantly during the decades following the Constantinople siege, possibly reflecting a pragmatic recognition that accommodation with Christian populations was essential for maintaining internal stability. Some Avar nobles may have undergone formal conversion to Christianity, while retaining traditional practices in private, creating a syncretic religious identity that satisfied both political necessities and personal beliefs. This religious pragmatism paralleled similar developments in other early medieval confederations that ruled over religiously diverse populations. Shamanistic practices remained central to Avar religious life throughout this period, with archaeological evidence indicating the continued importance of ritual specialists who served as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. Shamanic burial goods from mid-7th century sites include elaborately decorated drums, ritual knives with bone handles carved in animal shapes, and bronze plaques bearing symbolic representations of the world tree that connected earthly and celestial realms. These artifacts demonstrate the persistence of traditional steppe religious practices, despite increasing exposure to Christian influences. The syncretistic religious developments that emerged within Avar territories created unique forms of spiritual expression that combined elements from multiple traditions without completely abandoning any single system. Some burial sites contain artifacts that suggest the development of hybrid rituals incorporating both shamanistic and Christian elements, such as bronze crosses decorated with traditional animal motifs, or Christian religious texts written on materials traditionally associated with shamanic practices. These synthetic forms reflected the practical needs of governing diverse populations, while maintaining cultural continuity with steppe traditions. The administrative innovations implemented during this period of consolidation created institutional frameworks that would support Avar dominance for several more decades. The refined Tudun system that emerged during the 640s and 650s established clear hierarchies of authority, while providing sufficient flexibility to accommodate local variations in governance and cultural practice. Regional Tuduns received greater autonomy in managing their territories, but faced stricter accountability for tribute collection and military recruitment, creating incentives for efficient administration while maintaining central oversight. The tribute system that supported the Avar Confederation's military and administrative apparatus underwent significant refinement during this period, with standardized collection procedures and storage facilities that maximize revenue while minimizing resistance from subject populations. Agricultural tribute continued to provide the foundation of the system, but increasing emphasis was placed on craft production and specialized services that enhanced the Confederation's military capabilities. Slavic metalworkers produced standardized weapons and armor according to Avar specifications, while Germanic craftsmen contributed luxury goods that enhanced elite prestige and diplomatic effectiveness. The development of permanent storage facilities for tribute goods represented a significant departure from traditional nomadic practices and reflected the Confederation's adaptation to governing sedentary populations. These facilities, typically located at major administrative centers and fortified positions, required sophisticated organizational systems for inventory management and distribution. The scale of these operations, evidenced by archaeological remains of large granaries and workshops, indicates tribute collection that supported not only the Avar military elite, but also substantial populations of administrators, craftsmen, and service personnel. The military organization of the Avar Confederation during this period reflected both continuity with traditional steppe practices and adaptations necessitated by changing strategic circumstances. The core heavy cavalry units remained the foundation of Avar military power, but their organization and equipment underwent continuous refinement based on lessons learned during the Balkan campaigns and the Constantinople siege. The standardization of weapons and armor reached new levels of sophistication, with archaeological evidence indicating centralized production systems capable of equipping thousands of warriors with identical gear of consistently high quality. The integration of diverse populations into Avar military structures created opportunities for tactical innovation that enhanced the Confederation's overall combat effectiveness. Slavic infantry units, organized according to traditional tribal structures but equipped with standardized Avar weapons, developed specialized techniques for siege warfare and mountain combat that complemented the cavalry's capabilities on open terrain. Germanic warriors contributed expertise in fortification construction and defensive warfare that proved valuable in consolidating territorial gains and protecting supply lines during extended campaigns. The death of the last great Avar Khagan, around 680 AD, marked the beginning of a gradual but inexorable decline that would ultimately destroy the Confederation's dominance over Central Europe. The succession crisis that followed exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Avar political system that had been masked by decades of military success and territorial expansion. Unlike the smooth transitions of earlier periods, the struggle for leadership in the 680s fragmented along ethnic and regional lines, with different claimants drawing support from specific tribal groups and territorial administrators who saw opportunities to advance their own interests at the expense of central authority. The immediate cause of the succession crisis stemmed from the lack of a clear heir to the khaganate, a problem compounded by the Confederation's increasingly complex internal structure. The traditional steppe practice of selecting the most capable member of the ruling clan had become complicated by the integration of diverse populations with different concepts of legitimate authority. Slavic tribal leaders, who had achieved considerable influence within the Confederation's administrative hierarchy, favoured candidates who demonstrated understanding of agricultural management and sedentary governance. Germanic nobles, particularly those of Gepid ancestry, supported claimants who emphasized military prowess and traditional warrior values that resonated with their cultural background. The fragmentation of authority became apparent when three separate claimants simultaneously declared themselves Khagan in different regions of the Confederation's territory. The first, based at the traditional centre near modern-day Budapest, controlled the core Carpathian Basin territories and commanded the loyalty of the Confederation's elite heavy cavalry units. The second established his authority over the Slavic-dominated regions of the southern Balkans, drawing support from agricultural communities that had grown increasingly autonomous during the preceding decades. The third emerged in the western territories along the Frankish frontier, where constant military pressure had created a distinct warrior culture that valued independence from central oversight. This tripartite division of authority fundamentally undermined the tribute system that had supported Avar military and administrative capabilities for over a century. Regional leaders who had previously remitted substantial portions of their collected tribute to the central Khagan now retained these resources for their own use, claiming that the absence of unified leadership absolved them of traditional obligations. Agricultural communities that had reliably provided grain, livestock and craft products began withholding tribute payments or negotiating directly with local strongmen, rather than acknowledging central authority. The impact of reduced tribute collection became evident in the declining quality and standardization of Avar military equipment during the late 7th century. Archaeological evidence from burial sites dating to this period reveals significant variations in weapon design and armor construction that contrast sharply with the standardized equipment of earlier decades. Regional workshops that had previously produced weapons according to centralized specifications began developing local variations that reflected available materials and technical capabilities rather than Confederation-wide standards. This fragmentation of military production reduced the tactical effectiveness of Avar forces while increasing logistical complexity during joint operations. The Frankish kingdoms, meanwhile, had undergone their own transformation under the rising influence of the Carolingian mayors of the palace, who were systematically consolidating power at the expense of the increasingly ineffective Merovingian kings. Charles Martel, who achieved de facto control over the Frankish realms following his victory at the Battle of Toulouse in 721 AD, recognised the strategic opportunity presented by Avar internal divisions. Unlike his predecessors, who had generally maintained defensive postures along the eastern frontier, Martel began planning offensive operations designed to establish Frankish control over territories that had been under Avar dominance for over a century. The first major Frankish incursion into Avar territory occurred in 725 AD, when Martel's forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into the upper Danube valley, targeting Slavic settlements that provided agricultural tribute to the western Avar claimant. The Frankish army, numbering approximately 15,000 warriors, included both traditional Frankish infantry armed with Francisca throwing axes and spears, and newly organised cavalry units that had adopted stirrups and heavy lances in imitation of successful Avar tactics. This combined arms approach allowed the Franks to engage Avar forces effectively on their own terms while maintaining the tactical flexibility necessary for operations in unfamiliar territory. The Avar response to this Frankish invasion revealed the extent to which internal divisions had weakened the Confederation's military capabilities. The Western claimant, who bore primary responsibility for defending against Frankish expansion, commanded fewer than 8,000 warriors, including only 2,000 heavy cavalry of the type that had dominated European battlefields for over a century. The remaining forces consisted primarily of Slavic infantry and light cavalry drawn from Germanic populations that had limited experience fighting as coordinated units under Avar command. This reduced and fragmented force proved inadequate to counter the Frankish advance, resulting in the loss of several fortified positions and the retreat of Avar forces eastward beyond the Enns River. The Battle of Lauriacum, fought near the ruins of the old Roman fortress in 726 AD, demonstrated the changing balance of military power between the Franks and Avars. The Avar forces, commanded by a regional Tudun named Zodan, according to Frankish sources, attempted to employ traditional steppe tactics of feigned retreat and enveloping maneuvers that had proven effective against earlier opponents. However, the Frankish heavy cavalry, supported by disciplined infantry formations, maintained cohesion during the initial Avar assault and successfully countered the attempted encirclement. The battle's outcome, a decisive Frankish victory that resulted in the capture of substantial Avar treasure and the death of several high-ranking Avar commanders, marked the first major defeat of Avar forces by Western opponents in over 150 years. The psychological impact of the Lauriacum defeat extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, undermining Avar prestige among subject populations that had viewed their overlords as militarily invincible. Slavic tribal leaders in regions adjacent to the new Frankish-controlled territories began questioning the value of continued allegiance to Avar authority, particularly when that authority could no longer provide effective protection against external threats. Some communities initiated direct negotiations with Frankish administrators, offering tribute and military service in exchange for protection and recognition of their traditional territorial boundaries. The emergence of independent Slavic principalities represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Avar military decline. The Slavic populations of the Carpathian Basin and surrounding regions had developed sophisticated political and military institutions during their decades of integration into the Avar Confederation. Tribal leaders who had served as regional administrators under Avar oversight possessed the organizational skills and local legitimacy necessary to establish autonomous political entities when central authority weakened. These emerging principalities typically maintained the administrative structures and tribute collection systems developed under Avar rule while redirecting the resulting resources toward local defense and development rather than supporting distant khagans. The principality that emerged in the region of modern-day Slovakia, under the leadership of a Slavic nobleman named Pribina, represented the most successful example of this political transformation. Pribina, who had served as a Tudun under the central Avar claimant, declared independence around 730 AD and established control over the fertile agricultural valleys of the upper Danube and its tributaries. His forces, consisting primarily of Slavic infantry supplemented by former Avar cavalry, who had chosen to remain in the region rather than retreat eastward, successfully defended their territory against attempts at reconquest by both Avar and Frankish forces. The military organization of these independent Slavic principalities reflected their origins within the Avar Confederation, while adapting to new strategic circumstances. Slavic warriors retained the standardized weapons and tactical formations developed during their service in Avar armies, but they modified their approach to emphasize defensive warfare and territorial control rather than the offensive campaigns that had characterized Avar military doctrine. Fortified settlements constructed using techniques learned from Avar engineers provided secure bases for local defense while serving as administrative centers for tribute collection and craft production. The economic foundations of Slavic independence rested on the agricultural productivity that had made these regions valuable to the Avar Confederation in the first place. The fertile river valleys of the Carpathian Basin supported dense populations of farmers who produced substantial surpluses of grain, livestock, and craft goods. Under Avar rule, much of this surplus had been extracted as tribute and transported to support military campaigns or administrative centers in distant territories. Independent Slavic principalities could retain these resources for local use, funding defensive preparations and economic development that strengthened their ability to resist external pressure. The transformation of trade networks during this period reflected the broader political fragmentation that was undermining Avar authority throughout Central Europe. The extensive commercial connections that had linked the Carpathian Basin with markets throughout Europe and beyond had depended on the security and administrative coordination provided by unified Avar control. As political authority fragmented and military protection became unreliable, merchants increasingly avoided traditional trade routes through Avar territory in favour of alternatives that offered greater security and more predictable commercial conditions. The decline in trade revenue had cascading effects throughout the remaining Avar territories, reducing the resources available for maintaining military forces while undermining the economic incentives that had encouraged subject populations to remain loyal to Avar authority. Craft production, which had flourished under the standardized requirements and guaranteed markets provided by the Confederation's tribute system, declined as regional workshops lost access to raw materials and specialized techniques that had been coordinated through central administrative networks. The distinctive metalwork and luxury goods that had characterized Avar material culture became increasingly rare and localized in their production. The internal civil wars that erupted during the 730s further accelerated the Confederation's decline by consuming resources and manpower that could have been used to address external threats. The conflict between the central and western Avar claimants escalated into sustained military campaigns that devastated some of the Confederation's most productive territories. The siege of Carnuntum, where the western claimant had established his primary stronghold, lasted over 18 months and involved forces totaling nearly 30,000 warriors from both sides. The eventual capture of the fortress by forces loyal to the central claimant represented a Pyrrhic victory that left both factions significantly weakened. The human cost of these internal conflicts extended beyond battlefield casualties to include the displacement of civilian populations and the destruction of agricultural infrastructure that had supported Avar dominance for generations. Entire Slavic communities abandoned their traditional settlements to escape the fighting, migrating to regions under Frankish or Byzantine control where they could rebuild their lives without constant threat of military devastation. This population movement deprived the remaining Avar territories of the agricultural labour and tribute that had formed the foundation of the Confederation's economic strength. The role of Byzantine diplomacy in encouraging Avar fragmentation became increasingly apparent during the 740s, as imperial agents provided financial and military support to various claimants in exchange for territorial concessions and tribute agreements. The Byzantine Empire, which had struggled to contain Avar expansion for over a century, recognized the strategic opportunity presented by the Confederation's internal divisions. Imperial gold financed Slavic rebellions against Avar authority, while Byzantine military advisors helped organize defensive preparations in newly independent territories along the empire's northern frontier. The emergence of the Bulgarian Khaganate as a major power in the lower Danube region during this period further complicated the strategic situation facing the declining Avar Confederation. The Bulgars, who had established their authority over Slavic populations in the Eastern Balkans, represented a direct challenge to Avar territorial claims while offering an alternative model of steppe sedentary integration that appealed to populations dissatisfied with Avar rule. Bulgarian military success against Byzantine forces demonstrated that effective steppe confederation remained possible, making Avar failures appear more significant by comparison. The technological stagnation that characterized Avar military development during this period reflected the broader decline in the Confederation's institutional capabilities. The innovations in siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and military organization that had given the Avars decisive advantages over their opponents for over a century ceased to evolve as resources became scarce and administrative coordination deteriorated. Avar workshops continued producing weapons and armour according to traditional designs, but they failed to adapt to new tactical challenges presented by improved Frankish and Byzantine military techniques. The loss of institutional memory represented an equally serious problem as experienced administrators and military commanders died or defected without effectively training successors. The complex systems of tribute collection, military recruitment, and territorial administration that had enabled the Avars to govern diverse populations across extensive territories required specialized knowledge that took years to develop. The fragmentation of authority and reduction of resources during the late 7th and early 8th centuries prevented the systematic transmission of this knowledge to new generations of leaders, creating gaps in administrative capability that further undermined the confederation's effectiveness. The consolidation of Frankish power under Charlemagne's rule created an existential threat to the fragmented Avar confederation that its weakened leadership proved incapable of addressing through traditional diplomatic channels. By 788 AD, the Carolingian king had successfully unified most of Western Europe under his authority, establishing administrative and military systems that dwarfed the declining capabilities of the Avar khaganate. The Frankish realm's eastern frontier had gradually expanded into territories that had been under Avar control for 2 centuries, creating a volatile border zone where Slavic populations increasingly looked to Frankish protection rather than their traditional Avar overlords. The immediate catalyst for Charlemagne's systematic campaign against the Avars emerged from a series of border incidents that escalated throughout 787 and early 788 AD. Avar raiding parties, desperate to maintain tribute flows from increasingly rebellious subject populations, had begun crossing into Frankish territory to seize livestock and agricultural products from Bavarian settlements. These raids, while relatively small in scale compared to the massive campaigns of earlier centuries, violated the informal frontier agreements that had maintained relative stability along the Danube boundary for several decades. Charlemagne's response demonstrated the methodical approach to warfare that characterized Carolingian military doctrine. Rather than launching immediate retaliatory strikes, the Frankish king spent months gathering intelligence about Avar defensive capabilities, internal political divisions, and the location of major treasure repositories. Frankish merchants, many of whom had maintained trading relationships with Slavic communities under Avar control, provided detailed information about fortification layouts, garrison strengths, and the routes used for transporting tribute to central collection points. The strategic planning for the Avar campaigns reflected Charlemagne's understanding that traditional Frankish military tactics would require significant modification to succeed against opponents who had dominated European warfare for over 2 centuries. Avar heavy cavalry, despite the Confederation's internal problems, remained formidable opponents whose mobility and archery skills gave them significant advantages over conventional Frankish infantry formations. The Carolingian solution involved the systematic development of heavy cavalry units, modelled on successful Avar techniques, while maintaining the disciplined infantry formations that had proven effective in earlier Frankish conquests. The first phase of Charlemagne's Avar campaign began in late summer 788 AD, with coordinated advances along multiple axes designed to prevent the concentration of Avar defensive forces. The main Frankish army, numbering approximately 20,000 warriors, advanced eastward along the Danube Valley while smaller forces moved through the Alpine passes to threaten Avar positions in the south. This multi-pronged approach forced the Avar leadership to divide their already limited military resources while preventing the implementation of traditional steppe tactics that relied on concentrating superior forces against isolated enemy formations. The Frankish army's composition reflected decades of military evolution that had gradually adopted successful elements from various opponents while maintaining distinctively Carolingian organisational structures. Heavy cavalry formed the elite core of Frankish forces, with warriors wearing mail hauberks and carrying long lances designed for shock combat against enemy formations. These mounted troops had adopted stirrups and high-backed saddles that provided the stability necessary for effective lance charges, while maintaining the flexibility required for pursuing broken enemy forces across varied terrain. Frankish infantry retained their traditional role as the backbone of Carolingian military power, but their equipment and tactics had evolved significantly since earlier centuries. Warriors carried standardized spears, shields, and Francisca throwing axes, but they also employed crossbows and other missile weapons that provided effective counters to Avar archery. The disciplined formations that characterized Frankish infantry deployment allowed them to maintain cohesion under cavalry attack, while providing mutual support during advances against fortified positions. The siege train that accompanied Charlemagne's army represented one of the most sophisticated collections of military engineering equipment assembled in early medieval Europe. Frankish engineers had studied captured Avar siege engines and incorporated their design principles into improved versions that combined the mobility advantages of traditional steppe equipment with the destructive power of Roman-inspired heavy catapults. These hybrid designs could be quickly assembled from prefabricated components while delivering stone projectiles capable of breaching the earthwork fortifications that protected major Avar settlements. The initial Frankish advances encountered surprisingly limited resistance as Avar forces withdrew eastward rather than risking decisive battles against superior enemy numbers. This strategic retreat reflected both the Confederation's reduced military capabilities and a calculated decision to preserve their remaining strength for defending the most critical positions. Avar commanders recognized that their traditional tactical advantages had been largely negated by Frankish adoption of heavy cavalry and improved siege techniques, making prolonged defensive campaigns more viable than offensive operations. The abandonment of Western Avar territories proceeded according to established patterns that had been developed during earlier retreats from Frankish pressure. Portable wealth, including livestock, precious metals, and skilled craftsmen, was evacuated eastward toward the Confederation's core territories around the Ring. Agricultural populations received offers to accompany the retreating Avar forces, but many Slavic communities chose to remain in their traditional settlements and negotiate accommodation with the advancing Franks, rather than abandon their established farms and workshops. The Frankish occupation of abandoned Avar territories revealed the extent of the Confederation's earlier wealth and organizational sophistication. Fortified settlements contained substantial stores of weapons, armor, and military equipment that demonstrated the high quality of Avar metalworking, even during the period of political decline. Workshops for producing standardized military gear continued operating until the final evacuations, indicating that some aspects of the Confederation's administrative systems had remained functional despite broader political fragmentation. The integration of newly conquered Slavic populations into the Frankish administrative system proceeded along lines that reflected Carolingian experience in managing diverse ethnic groups throughout their expanding realm. Slavic tribal leaders who demonstrated loyalty to Frankish authority received confirmation of their local positions while accepting responsibility for tribute collection and military recruitment among their followers. This approach paralleled earlier Avar practices but operated within the framework of Frankish legal and administrative traditions that emphasized written agreements and standardized obligations. The advance toward the Ring, the fortified complex that served as the Avar Confederation's primary treasure repository and ceremonial center, required Frankish forces to penetrate increasingly sophisticated defensive systems that had been developed over 2 centuries of continuous improvement. The Ring itself consisted of multiple concentric fortifications constructed using a combination of earthworks, wooden palisades, and stone walls that created overlapping fields of fire for defending archers while providing secure storage for the Confederation's accumulated wealth. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Ring complex covered an area of approximately 50 square kilometers, making it one of the largest fortified installations in contemporary Europe. The outer defences consisted of earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, and punctuated by stone towers that commanded key approaches to the complex. These fortifications incorporated design elements borrowed from Byzantine, Germanic, and traditional steppe military architecture, creating a hybrid defensive system that maximized the advantages of each tradition while compensating for their individual weaknesses. The inner fortifications surrounding the actual treasure repositories represented the pinnacle of Avar military engineering, with stone walls rising over 10 meters in height and protected by elaborate systems of ditches, obstacles, and flanking positions. The construction techniques employed in these walls demonstrated sophisticated understanding of masonry principles that had been acquired through contact with Byzantine and Roman building traditions. The walls incorporated both defensive and symbolic elements, with decorative stonework that proclaimed the power and prestige of the Avar khaganate to both subjects and enemies. The siege of the ring began in earnest during the spring of 795 AD, after Charlemagne had spent the winter months consolidating his control over the western Avar territories and gathering intelligence about the fortress complex's layout and defensive capabilities. The Frankish assault involved approximately 15,000 warriors, supported by the largest collection of siege engines assembled during the Carolingian period. The systematic nature of the attack reflected lessons learned during earlier sieges, while adapting to the unique challenges presented by the ring's sophisticated fortifications. Frankish siege tactics emphasized the systematic reduction of defensive capabilities through coordinated attacks on multiple sections of the fortification simultaneously. Catapult bombardments targeted specific sections of the walls, while mobile siege towers provided platforms for archers to suppress defensive fire from the ramparts. Simultaneously, Frankish engineers constructed tunnels designed to undermine key sections of the fortifications, using techniques that had been perfected during earlier campaigns against Saxon and Lombard strongholds. The Avar defence of the ring demonstrated the Confederation's retention of military expertise despite their broader political decline. Defending forces, estimated at approximately 8,000 warriors, employed sophisticated counter-siege techniques that prolonged the assault for several months. Avar engineers constructed counter-tunnels designed to intercept Frankish mining operations, while organising sorties that targeted vulnerable siege equipment during construction and positioning phases. The psychological dimensions of the ring's siege proved as important as the purely military aspects, as the fortress complex held profound symbolic significance for both Avar identity and the broader political structure of Central Europe. The ring served not only as a treasure repository, but also as the ceremonial centre, where Khagans received investiture and where the Confederation's most important religious rituals were conducted. Its fall would represent not merely a military defeat, but the effective end of Avar political and cultural independence. The role of Slavic auxiliaries in the Frankish siege operations revealed the extent to which former Avar subjects had transferred their allegiance to Carolingian authority. Slavic warriors who had previously served in Avar armies now provided crucial intelligence about defensive weaknesses, while contributing specialized knowledge about siege techniques that had been developed during their service under Avar commanders. This defection of military expertise represented perhaps the most significant factor in enabling Frankish success against fortifications that had been designed by many of the same individuals who now served their enemies. The final assault on the ring occurred during late summer 796 AD, when coordinated Frankish attacks successfully breached the outer fortifications at multiple points simultaneously. The breakthrough resulted from the collapse of a major section of the eastern wall that had been weakened by months of bombardment and undermining operations. Avar defenders attempted to conduct a fighting withdrawal to the inner fortifications, but the speed of the Frankish advance prevented the organised evacuation of the treasure repositories that had been the primary objective of their prolonged resistance. The capture of the ring's treasure exceeded even Charlemagne's expectations, revealing the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of successful tribute collection and military conquest. Frankish chroniclers described wagon trains loaded with gold, silver, precious stones, and luxury goods that required weeks to transport to secure locations in Frankish territory. The quantity of precious metals alone was sufficient to finance major construction projects throughout the Carolingian realm, while providing substantial rewards for the warriors who had participated in the campaign. The treasure's composition reflected the diverse sources of Avar wealth, and the extensive trade networks that had connected the Confederation with markets throughout Europe and beyond. Byzantine gold coins, Sassanid silver vessels, Germanic jewellery, and Slavic craft products demonstrated the breadth of economic relationships that had supported Avar prosperity. Religious artifacts from multiple traditions indicated the Confederation's pragmatic approach to managing diverse populations while maintaining their own cultural identity. The destruction of the ring as a political and military centre marked the effective end of organised Avar resistance to Frankish expansion, though scattered groups of warriors continued guerrilla operations in the mountainous regions of the Carpathian Basin for several more years. The psychological impact of the fortress complex's fall extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as Slavic populations throughout the region interpreted the defeat as definitive proof that Avar power had been permanently broken. The systematic dismantling of Avar administrative structures in the conquered territories proceeded according to established Carolingian practices for integrating new provinces into their expanding realm. Frankish administrators replaced Avar tuduns while maintaining many of the tribute collection and military recruitment systems that had proven effective under the previous regime. This administrative continuity eased the transition for local populations while ensuring that the productive capacity of the conquered territories could be quickly integrated into Carolingian economic and military systems. The final phases of Avar resistance centred on the mountainous regions of Transylvania and the eastern Carpathians, where difficult terrain provided natural advantages for defensive warfare. Small bands of Avar warriors, supported by loyal Slavic communities, conducted hit-and-run attacks against Frankish supply lines and isolated garrisons. These operations, while militarily insignificant, demonstrated the persistence of Avar military traditions and the continued loyalty of some populations to their traditional rulers. The gradual suppression of these final resistance efforts required Frankish forces to adapt their tactics to the challenges of mountain warfare, where heavy cavalry proved less effective than in the open terrain of the Danube Valley. Frankish commanders increasingly relied on Slavic auxiliaries who possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and the locations of hidden Avar strongholds. The systematic nature of these operations, involving the construction of fortified bases and the establishment of permanent garrisons, ensured that Avar resistance could not regenerate even if initial suppression efforts proved incomplete. The submission of Tudun, the last recognised Avar Khagan, to Charlemagne's court at Aachen in 803 AD represented far more than a ceremonial acknowledgement of defeat. The aging ruler, accompanied by a small retinue of surviving nobles, and carrying the few remaining symbols of Avar authority, performed the ritual of submission that formally ended over 2 centuries of independent Avar rule in Central Europe. Contemporary Frankish chroniclers described Tudun as a man broken by years of military defeats and political fragmentation, his once elaborate costume reduced to simple garments that bore only faded traces of the gold embroidery that had traditionally marked Avar royalty. The ceremony itself followed established Carolingian protocols for receiving submissions from defeated rulers, but the specific terms imposed on the remaining Avar populations reflected Charlemagne's understanding of the unique challenges presented by governing nomadic peoples who had spent generations dominating sedentary populations. Unlike the wholesale displacement policies applied to some conquered Germanic tribes, the Carolingian approach to the Avars involved systematic fragmentation and controlled resettlement designed to prevent any possibility of political reorganisation, while preserving their value as warriors and administrators within the expanding Frankish realm. Tudun's formal submission included the surrender of all remaining Avar military forces, estimated at fewer than 3,000 warriors scattered across the eastern Carpathian Basin and the mountainous regions of Transylvania. These remnant forces, many of whom had spent years conducting guerrilla operations against Frankish expansion, faced stark choices between integration into Carolingian military units as auxiliary troops or exile beyond the frontiers of Christian Europe. The majority chose integration, recognizing that continued resistance offered no realistic prospect of restoring Avar independence, while potentially resulting in complete extermination of their people. The systematic dismantling of Avar political structures proceeded according to comprehensive plans developed by Carolingian administrators who had studied the Confederation's organizational methods during years of military campaigns. The traditional hierarchy of khagans, tudans, and tribal leaders was completely eliminated, with former Avar nobles either executed for continued resistance or relegated to subordinate positions within the new administrative framework. The decimal military organization that had characterized Avar forces for centuries was dissolved, with individual warriors assigned to Frankish units where their traditional command relationships could not be maintained. The forced resettlement policies implemented throughout the former Avar territories reflected Carolingian understanding that the Confederation's military effectiveness had depended largely on maintaining concentrated populations of experienced warriors who could support each other through kinship networks and shared cultural traditions. Avar families were systematically separated and relocated to different regions of the Carolingian realm, with particular emphasis on distributing them among established Frankish and Slavic communities where they would constitute small minorities unable to maintain independent cultural practices. The largest single resettlement operation involved approximately 8,000 Avar civilians who were transported from their traditional settlements in the Tisza River Valley to new locations in Bavaria, Alemannia, and northern Italy. These forced migrants included craftsmen whose metalworking skills were highly valued by Carolingian administrators, agricultural workers who possessed expertise in managing the fertile river-bottom lands of the Carpathian Basin, and former administrative personnel whose literacy and organizational capabilities made them useful for governing other subject populations within the expanding Frankish realm. The psychological trauma inflicted by these resettlement policies extended beyond the immediate disruption of family and community relationships to include the systematic destruction of cultural landmarks and religious sites that had maintained Avar identity for generations. Sacred groves where shamanic rituals had been conducted were cut down and converted to Christian churches, while burial grounds containing the remains of Avar ancestors were ploughed under to create agricultural fields. These deliberate acts of cultural destruction aimed to prevent the development of pilgrimage sites or symbolic centres that might serve as focal points for future resistance movements. The establishment of Frankish administrative control over former Avar territories proceeded through the creation of new territorial units called marches, frontier provinces designed to provide military security while facilitating the integration of conquered populations into Carolingian political and economic systems. The Pannonian March, established in 803 AD under the command of a Frankish margrave named Gerald, encompassed the core territories of the former Avar Confederation and served as the model for subsequent frontier administration throughout the Carolingian realm. Gerald's administrative approach reflected lessons learned during earlier Carolingian conquests, while adapting to the specific challenges presented by governing populations that had experienced centuries of nomadic rule. The new margrave maintained many of the tribute collection systems developed under Avar administration, recognizing that these mechanisms had proven effective in extracting resources from diverse populations while maintaining economic productivity. However, the destination of collected tribute shifted from supporting Avar military campaigns to funding Frankish fortifications and administrative centres that consolidated Carolingian control over the region. The construction of new fortified centres throughout the Pannonian March demonstrated Carolingian commitment to permanent occupation rather than simple tribute extraction. These fortifications, typically built at strategic river crossings and mountain passes, incorporated both military and civilian functions that created nuclei for urban development in regions that had previously been dominated by dispersed agricultural settlements and nomadic camps. The fortress at Carnuntum, rebuilt on the ruins of the old Roman legionary base, became the March's administrative capital and the primary residence of the Frankish Margrave. Archaeological evidence from these newly constructed Carolingian centres reveals the systematic replacement of Avar material culture with Frankish alternatives that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Traditional Avar pottery styles, characterised by distinctive geometric patterns and specialised forms adapted to nomadic lifestyles, disappeared from the archaeological record within a generation of Frankish conquest. Frankish potters introduced new vessel types designed for sedentary agricultural communities, while decorative motifs emphasise Christian symbolism rather than the animal figures that had characterised Avar artistic traditions. The transformation of metalworking traditions provides particularly clear evidence of cultural disruption and continuity in post-Avar Pannonia. Avar craftsmen had developed sophisticated techniques for producing the elaborate belt fittings, weapons and horse gear that had distinguished their material culture throughout Europe. Under Frankish rule, these same craftsmen were required to produce items according to Carolingian specifications, creating weapons and tools that followed Germanic design principles rather than steppe traditions. However, technical analysis of metalwork from early Carolingian sites reveals the persistence of Avar manufacturing techniques, indicating that knowledge transfer occurred even when cultural expression was suppressed. The religious transformation of former Avar territories represented one of the most comprehensive aspects of Carolingian integration policies. The systematic Christianization of populations that had maintained traditional shamanistic beliefs for centuries required extensive missionary activities supported by administrative pressure and economic incentives. Bavarian and Frankish clergy established monasteries and churches throughout the Pannonian March, often building these institutions on sites that had previously served as centres for traditional Avar religious practices. The conversion process revealed significant variations in how different populations adapted to Christian requirements while attempting to maintain elements of their traditional beliefs. Former Avar elites, whose political survival depended on demonstrating loyalty to Carolingian authority, typically underwent formal baptism and adopted Christian names while privately maintaining some traditional practices. Archaeological evidence from elite burial sites dating to the early 9th century shows Christian grave goods alongside traditional items like horse bits and shamanic symbols, suggesting syncretic religious practices that combined elements from both traditions. Slavic populations within the former Avar territories often experienced less dramatic religious transitions, as many communities had already adopted Christian practices during the later years of Avar rule when political fragmentation had reduced central control over religious observance. These populations typically retained their existing Christian identity, while adapting to Frankish liturgical practices and ecclesiastical organisation. The continuity of Slavic Christian traditions provided a foundation for cultural stability that eased their integration into Carolingian administrative systems. The economic integration of former Avar territories into the Carolingian realm required significant modifications to existing production and distribution systems that had been designed to support nomadic military campaigns rather than sedentary agricultural communities. The tribute system that had channeled agricultural surpluses toward maintaining Avar cavalry forces was restructured to support Frankish fortifications, administrative centres, and military garrisons stationed throughout the March territories. This reorientation of economic flows created new patterns of regional specialisation that emphasised local self-sufficiency rather than the centralised resource concentration that had characterised Avar administration. The transformation of agricultural practices reflected broader changes in land tenure and population organisation that accompanied Carolingian conquest. Avar pastoral nomadism, which had maintained extensive grazing areas for horse herds while supporting limited agricultural production, gave way to intensive farming systems that maximised grain production to support growing urban populations in the new Frankish administrative centres. Traditional Avar grazing lands were converted to arable fields, while remaining pastoral activities were confined to marginal areas unsuitable for crop production. The fate of Avar horse herds, which had formed the foundation of the Confederation's military power, illustrates the systematic nature of Carolingian policies designed to prevent any possibility of military resurgence. The finest animals were confiscated and transported to Frankish territories where they enhanced Carolingian cavalry capabilities, while remaining herds were either slaughtered for food or bred with Frankish stock to produce animals better suited to agricultural work than military campaigns. This deliberate destruction of Avar horse breeding capabilities eliminated one of the most distinctive aspects of their traditional culture, while ensuring that future generations would lack the mounted mobility that had characterized their ancestors. The linguistic transformation of former Avar territories provides evidence for both cultural continuity and disruption during the early decades of Carolingian rule. Avar language, which appears to have been a Turkic dialect related to other Central Asian nomadic tongues, ceased to function as an administrative language within a generation of Frankish conquest. Latin became the language of official correspondence and legal proceedings, while local populations increasingly adopted Germanic or Slavic languages depending on their regional circumstances and the ethnic composition of their immediate communities. However, linguistic borrowing in both directions suggests that Avar cultural influences persisted even after political independence ended. Frankish administrative terminology incorporated Avar words related to horse management, military organisation, and tribute collection, indicating that Carolingian administrators recognised the practical value of existing systems even when they rejected Avar political authority. Similarly, Slavic dialects in the region retained Avar loanwords related to metalworking, warfare, and political organisation, demonstrating the lasting impact of centuries of cultural interaction. The persistence of Avar cultural elements within Slavic communities represents one of the most significant aspects of post-conquest cultural continuity in the Carpathian Basin. Slavic populations that had been integrated into Avar society for generations maintained many practices and traditions that had developed during the Confederation period, even when formal Avar political structures disappeared. Archaeological evidence from Slavic settlements dating to the early 9th century reveals the continued production of pottery styles, metalwork techniques, and architectural forms that combined Slavic and Avar elements in ways that distinguished these communities from Slavic groups in other regions. The gradual emergence of new political identities among the former subjects of the Avar Confederation reflected the complex process of cultural synthesis that occurred under Carolingian rule. Populations that had identified themselves as Avars, Slavs, or Gepids during the Confederation period began developing regional identities based on their specific locations within the new March territories rather than their ethnic origins. These emerging identities incorporated elements from multiple cultural traditions while adapting to the administrative and religious requirements imposed by Frankish rule. The archaeological record from the 810 Rare S and 820 S reveals increasing standardization of material culture throughout the former Avar territories as Carolingian administrative systems achieved greater effectiveness in governing diverse populations. Pottery styles, metalwork designs, and architectural techniques became more uniform across the region, reflecting both the imposition of Frankish standards and the breakdown of local traditions that had maintained cultural distinctiveness during the Avar period. This standardization process accelerated as new generations grew up under Carolingian rule without direct experience of Avar political independence. The military integration of former Avar warriors into Carolingian forces proceeded along lines that reflected both the practical value of their combat experience and the political necessity of preventing organized resistance. Avar heavy cavalry techniques, which had dominated European warfare for over 2 centuries, were systematically studied and incorporated into Frankish military doctrine, while the individuals who possessed this expertise were distributed among different units to prevent the maintenance of traditional command relationships. Former Avar officers found themselves serving as instructors and advisors within Carolingian military schools, where their knowledge of siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and military organisation enhanced Frankish capabilities while ensuring their loyalty through integration into the expanding imperial system. The transformation of settlement patterns throughout the former Avar territories reflected the systematic replacement of nomadic and semi-nomadic lifestyles with sedentary agricultural communities that could be more easily controlled and taxed by Carolingian administrators. Traditional Avar seasonal migration routes were blocked by new fortifications and agricultural settlements, while former grazing areas were converted to permanent farmland that supported growing populations of Frankish and Slavic colonists. These changes fundamentally altered the demographic composition of the Carpathian Basin, while eliminating the environmental foundations that had supported Avar nomadic traditions for centuries. The systematic destruction of Avar political structures by the Carolingians could not entirely erase the profound impact this confederation had left across Central and Eastern Europe. Modern archaeological investigations, beginning in earnest during the late 19th century and accelerating dramatically since the 1960s, have revealed the extraordinary scope of Avar cultural influence and technological innovation that persisted long after their political collapse. The Hungarian Academy of Sciences' systematic excavation programs, combined with rescue archaeology conducted ahead of major infrastructure projects, have uncovered over 60,000 Avar period graves across the Carpathian Basin, providing unprecedented insights into a civilization that contemporary written sources described only fragmentarily. The distinctive burial practices that characterized Avar society throughout their 250-year dominance of Central Europe reveal sophisticated religious beliefs and social hierarchies that evolved considerably over time. Early Avar burials from the 560s and 570s demonstrate clear continuity with Central Asian steppe traditions, featuring deceased warriors interred alongside their horses in elaborate shaft graves that could reach depths of 4 meters. These early graves typically contained the warrior positioned on his back, with weapons arranged according to specific ritual requirements, composite bows placed along the right side, quivers filled with standardized arrowheads positioned near the feet, and curved sabres laid across the chest with their hilts pointing toward the deceased's right hand. The horse burials that accompanied these warrior interments provide crucial evidence for understanding both Avar religious beliefs and their practical approach to maintaining cavalry effectiveness. Archaeological analysis reveals that horses were typically killed through precise cuts to major neck arteries, suggesting ritual specialists who possessed detailed anatomical knowledge and performed these sacrifices according to established ceremonial protocols. The positioning of horse remains within burial chambers followed consistent patterns, with the animals' heads oriented toward the east and their bodies arranged to suggest movement toward the afterlife realm where deceased warriors would continue their mounted existence. The evolution of Avar burial practices during the 7th century reflects their increasing integration with sedentary populations and gradual adaptation to European religious influences. Graves from this period show reduced emphasis on horse sacrifice, with many elite burials containing only horse bits, stirrups, and other riding equipment, rather than complete animal remains. This transformation likely resulted from both practical considerations related to the increasing scarcity of suitable horses and religious syncretism that incorporated Christian concepts of afterlife that did not require physical mounts for spiritual transportation. The grave goods that accompanied Avar burials demonstrate remarkable consistency in their symbolic significance, while showing continuous technological innovation throughout the Confederation's existence. Belt sets, which appear in virtually every adult male burial of significant status, evolved from relatively simple leather straps with bronze fittings to elaborate constructions featuring dozens of precisely crafted metal plaques arranged according to complex decorative schemes. These belt sets served both practical functions as supports for weapons and tools and symbolic purposes, as indicators of social rank, military achievements, and tribal affiliations within the broader Avar confederation. The metalworking techniques employed in producing Avar belt fittings represent some of the most sophisticated craftsmanship in early medieval Europe, combining influences from Byzantine goldsmithing, Germanic animal-style decoration, and Central Asian geometric patterns. Avar artisans developed distinctive granulation techniques that created intricate surface textures through the precise application of tiny gold spheres, while their mastery of filigree work produced delicate wire patterns that enhanced the visual impact of larger decorative elements. The technical analysis of these pieces reveals production methods that required specialized tools and extensive training, indicating the existence of professional craftsmen who maintained workshops capable of producing standardized items for distribution throughout Avar territories. The archaeological evidence for Avar technological contributions to medieval European development extends far beyond decorative metalwork to include fundamental innovations in military equipment, agricultural techniques, and urban planning. The widespread adoption of stirrups throughout Europe during the 7th and 8th centuries can be directly traced to Avar influence, with archaeological sites across the former Confederation territories yielding thousands of stirrup fragments that demonstrate the evolution of design from simple leather loops to sophisticated iron constructions that provided cavalry with unprecedented stability and striking power. Stirrup development under Avar patronage proceeded through several distinct phases that reflected both technological innovation and adaptation to changing tactical requirements. Early Avar stirrups, dating to the late 6th century, consisted of bronze or iron loops suspended from leather straps that provided basic foot support for mounted warriors. Archaeological specimens from major Avar cemeteries show gradual improvements in design, with broader foot plates that distributed weight more effectively and strengthened attachment points that reduced the risk of equipment failure during combat. The most advanced Avar stirrup designs, found in 8th century contexts, incorporated decorative elements that indicated their owner's status while maintaining the functional characteristics that made them essential components of heavy cavalry equipment. The impact of Avar stirrup technology on European warfare extended far beyond simple equipment adoption to fundamental changes in military organization and tactical doctrine. Contemporary Frankish sources describe the systematic study of captured Avar equipment by Carolingian military engineers, who recognized the technological superiority of Avar cavalry gear and implemented comprehensive programs to reproduce these innovations for their own forces. The Battle of Tours in 732 AD, where Frankish heavy cavalry played a decisive role in defeating the Umayyad invasion, relied heavily on stirrup technology that had been acquired through contact with Avar forces during earlier frontier conflicts. The agricultural innovations introduced by the Avars reflected their remarkable adaptability in transitioning from nomadic pastoralism to the management of sedentary farming communities. Archaeological excavations at former Avar administrative centres reveal sophisticated irrigation systems that maximised agricultural productivity in the fertile river valleys of the Carpathian Basin. These systems incorporated elements from both Central Asian water management techniques and Roman hydraulic engineering, creating hybrid solutions that proved more effective than either tradition alone in addressing the specific environmental conditions of their new territories. The Avar approach to agricultural intensification involved the systematic modification of natural drainage patterns to create controlled flooding systems that deposited fertile sediments across cultivated fields while preventing destructive inundations during periods of excessive rainfall. Excavations near the former ring fortress have uncovered extensive networks of channels, dikes, and retention basins that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles and careful planning that coordinated agricultural activities across entire river watersheds. These systems required substantial labour investments and ongoing maintenance that could only be sustained through the tribute obligations imposed on subject populations, but their productivity gains supported population densities that exceeded pre-Avar levels by significant margins. The preservation of Avar placenames throughout Central and Eastern Europe provides compelling evidence for the lasting impact of their territorial, administration and settlement patterns. Linguistic analysis of modern toponyms reveals hundreds of locations whose names derive from Avar administrative terminology, military designations, or personal names of prominent Confederation leaders. The concentration of these place names follows patterns that correspond closely to archaeological evidence for Avar settlement density, creating complementary data sets that enhance understanding of their territorial organisation and population distribution. Hungarian place names containing elements like Avar, Tarjan and Gyula cluster primarily in regions that archaeological evidence indicates were centres of Avar political and military power. The persistence of these toponyms through centuries of political change demonstrates their deep integration into local geographical knowledge and suggests that Avar administrative structures maintain sufficient stability and legitimacy to influence how populations conceptualize their territorial organization long after the Confederation's political collapse. The linguistic influences of Avar administration extended beyond simple place names to include loanwords that entered Hungarian, Slavic, and Germanic languages throughout their former territories. Hungarian retains numerous terms related to military organisation, animal husbandry and political authority that derive from Avar usage, indicating cultural continuities that survive the Carolingian conquest and subsequent political transformations. Words like Euro, Tarjan, and various horse-related terminology demonstrate the persistence of Avar cultural concepts within populations that continue to inhabit their former territories. Slavic languages throughout the Carpathian Basin and Balkans similarly preserve Avar loanwords, particularly in specialised vocabularies related to metalworking, warfare, and political organisation. The distribution of these linguistic borrowings corresponds closely to regions where archaeological evidence indicates intensive Avar-Slavic interaction, supporting historical accounts of extensive cultural synthesis between these populations during the Confederation period. Technical terms for specific types of weapons, armour components, and metalworking techniques appear in multiple Slavic dialects with forms that suggest borrowing from a common Avar source, indicating standardized terminology that facilitated communication across the Confederation's diverse territories. The archaeological investigation of Avar urban centres has revealed sophisticated approaches to city planning and infrastructure development that influence medieval European urban design principles. The ring fortress complex, partially excavated since the 1950s, demonstrates organisational capabilities that rivaled contemporary Byzantine and Frankish administrative centres, while incorporating distinctive steppe nomadic concepts of spatial organisation. The complex's concentric layout with residential, administrative, and ceremonial areas arranged in clearly defined zones separated by fortified barriers provided models for defensive architecture that were subsequently adopted throughout Central Europe. The residential areas within major Avar centres reveal housing styles that combine traditional nomadic flexibility with the permanent construction techniques necessary for sedentary administrative functions. Excavated structures typically feature modular designs that could be expanded or modified according to changing needs, while maintaining consistent orientations and spatial relationships that reflected Avar cultural preferences. These buildings incorporated heating systems adapted from Roman hypocaust technology, storage facilities designed for managing tribute goods from diverse sources, and workshop areas equipped for specialised craft production that supported both military requirements and luxury consumption by Avar elites. The craft production facilities discovered at Avar sites demonstrate industrial organisation that achieved unprecedented scales of standardised manufacturing for early medieval Europe. Weapon production workshops at major centres contained specialised tools, raw material stockpiles, and finished goods inventories that indicate systematic approaches to equipping large military forces with identical equipment. The quality control evident in archaeological assemblages suggests oversight by master craftsmen who maintained strict standards while training apprentices in techniques that required years of experience to master fully. Pottery production represents another area where Avar technological contributions significantly influenced European material culture development. Avar potters developed distinctive wheel-throwing techniques that produced vessels with thinner walls and more consistent forms than contemporary hand-built pottery traditions. These technical innovations, combined with decorative styles that incorporated geometric patterns derived from textile and metalwork traditions, created ceramic traditions that influenced pottery production throughout Central and Eastern Europe for centuries after Avar political collapse. The archaeological evidence for Avar religious practices reveals complex belief systems that combined traditional Central Asian shamanism with elements borrowed from Christianity, Germanic paganism, and other traditions encountered during their European settlement. Ritual deposits found at major Avar centres contain bronze mirrors, animal-shaped amulets, and ceremonial weapons that indicate the continued importance of shamanic practices throughout the Confederation period. However, the same deposits often include Christian crosses, Byzantine religious medallions, and other artifacts that suggest syncretic religious developments that accommodated diverse belief systems within Avar territories. The shamanic elements in Avar religious practice demonstrate remarkable continuity with Central Asian traditions, while showing adaptations to European environmental and social conditions. Bronze mirrors decorated with animal motifs and geometric patterns that represented cosmological concepts appear consistently in elite Avar burials throughout their territorial extent, indicating shared religious beliefs that transcended ethnic boundaries within the Confederation. The symbolic systems represented in these artifacts show influences from Tengrist sky worship, ancestral veneration practices, and animal spirit beliefs that had characterized steppe nomadic religions for centuries before Avar migration to Europe. The gradual incorporation of Christian elements into Avar religious practices proceeded along different trajectories among various populations within the Confederation, reflecting both voluntary adoption and administrative pressure from Christian neighbours. Elite Avar burials from the later 7th and early 8th centuries increasingly contain Christian symbols, alongside traditional shamanic grave goods, suggesting religious syncretism that allowed individuals to maintain traditional beliefs while acknowledging Christian political and cultural influences. This religious flexibility demonstrated characteristic Avar pragmatism in managing diverse populations while adapting to changing political circumstances. The preservation of Avar cultural traditions within Slavic communities throughout Central and Eastern Europe represents one of the most significant aspects of their lasting legacy. Archaeological evidence from Slavic settlements in regions formerly under Avar control reveals the persistence of material culture traditions, craft techniques, and settlement patterns that had developed during centuries of cultural interaction. These continuities suggest that Avar influence on Slavic development extended far beyond simple political domination to include fundamental contributions to technological knowledge, social organization, and cultural identity that shaped Slavic civilization throughout the medieval period. Modern genetic studies of populations throughout the former Avar territories have provided additional evidence for understanding their demographic impact and cultural integration patterns. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Avar cemeteries reveals populations with mixed Central Asian, European and Mediterranean ancestry that reflects the Confederation's origins in Central Asian migrations, combined with extensive intermarriage with local populations during their European settlement. These genetic patterns correspond closely to archaeological evidence for cultural synthesis, supporting historical accounts of Avar integration policies that encouraged assimilation rather than ethnic separation. The genetic data emerging from contemporary studies reveals patterns that extend far beyond simple demographic mixing to encompass fundamental questions about ethnogenesis and cultural transmission in early medieval Europe. Population geneticists working with skeletal remains from major Avar cemeteries have identified distinctive haplogroups that trace back to Central Asian populations, while documenting extensive admixture with local European groups throughout the Confederation's territorial extent. The frequency of East Asian genetic markers decreases systematically from east to west across former Avar territories, suggesting gradual demographic dilution as the Confederation expanded, while maintaining cultural cohesion through institutional rather than purely ethnic mechanisms. These genetic findings have profound implications for understanding the Avar role in transforming post-Roman Europe's demographic landscape. Rather than representing a simple conquest and replacement scenario, the evidence suggests complex processes of integration that created new population syntheses throughout Central Europe. The persistence of Central Asian genetic signatures in modern Hungarian, Slovak and Romanian populations indicates that Avar demographic contributions remained significant components of regional gene pools long after their political collapse. This biological legacy parallels the cultural and technological influences that shaped medieval European development across multiple domains. The Avar contribution to Slavic ethnogenesis represents perhaps their most enduring historical impact, fundamentally shaping the development of peoples who would dominate Eastern Europe for the subsequent millennium. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that Slavic populations under Avar rule developed distinctive material culture traditions, settlement patterns, and technological capabilities that distinguish them from Slavic groups in other regions. The standardized pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and agricultural practices that emerged in Avar-controlled territories created cultural foundations that influenced Slavic development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The political structures that evolved within Avar territories provided templates for early medieval Slavic state formation that proved remarkably durable and influential. The tributary relationships, administrative hierarchies, and territorial organization systems developed under Avar oversight became models for subsequent Slavic political entities throughout Central and Eastern Europe. The Great Moravian Empire, which emerged in the 9th century from territories formerly under Avar control, inherited administrative traditions, military organization principles, and diplomatic practices that had been refined during centuries of Avar rule. These institutional continuities provided stability during the transition from Avar to Slavic political dominance, while facilitating the rapid development of sophisticated state structures. The military innovations pioneered under Avar auspices had transformative effects on European warfare that extended far beyond their immediate territorial boundaries. The systematic development of heavy cavalry techniques, siege warfare capabilities, and combined arms tactics created military doctrines that influenced European martial traditions for centuries. Frankish military manuals from the Carolingian period explicitly reference Avar tactical innovations, while Byzantine military treatises describe defensive measures specifically designed to counter Avar siege techniques. The widespread adoption of stirrups, improved armour designs and standardised weapons production throughout medieval Europe can be directly traced to technological developments that occurred within Avar territories. The archaeological record reveals that Avar military innovations extended beyond simple equipment improvements to encompass fundamental changes in military organisation and logistics. The decimal command structures, standardised equipment production, and systematic training programs developed by Avar military administrators provided models for professional army organisation that influenced medieval European military development. The integration of diverse ethnic groups into effective fighting forces demonstrated organisational capabilities that subsequent European powers studied and adapted for their own military systems. Historiographical interpretations of Avar society and culture have undergone dramatic transformations since serious scholarly investigation began in the 19th century. Early Hungarian historians, working within nationalist frameworks that emphasised Magyar origins and achievements, initially viewed the Avars primarily as predecessors whose legacy provided historical legitimacy for Hungarian territorial claims. This perspective, exemplified by scholars like Gyula Nemeth and István Bona, emphasise continuities between Avar and Hungarian material culture, while minimising the extent of cultural synthesis with Slavic and Germanic populations. The development of systematic archaeological methodology during the mid-20th century fundamentally altered scholarly understanding of Avar society by providing empirical evidence that challenged nationalist interpretations. Excavations conducted under the supervision of archaeologists like Ilona Kovrig and Andras Alfoldi revealed the extraordinary diversity of Avar material culture and the extensive evidence for cultural interaction with subject populations. These findings demonstrated that Avar civilization represented a complex synthesis of traditions, rather than simple cultural continuity from Central Asian origins, forcing scholars to develop more sophisticated models of ethnogenesis and cultural transmission. Contemporary scholarship has increasingly emphasized the Avars' role as cultural mediators who facilitated the transmission of technological innovations, artistic traditions, and institutional practices across the vast territories of early medieval Europe. Scholars like Falco Daim, Tivadar Vida, and Gergely Chiki have demonstrated that Avar territories served as crucial nodes in networks that connected Byzantine, Frankish, Slavic, and steppe nomadic civilizations. This mediating function enabled the Avars to synthesize diverse cultural elements while creating distinctive traditions that influenced European development across multiple domains. The recognition of Avar contributions to European technological development has led to fundamental reassessments of early medieval innovation patterns. Research by specialists in medieval technology like Lynn White Jr. and Bernard Bachrach has demonstrated that many innovations traditionally attributed to Frankish or Byzantine sources actually originated within Avar territories before spreading to other European regions. The systematic study of metallurgical techniques, agricultural innovations, and urban planning principles has revealed the extent to which Avar cultural synthesis contributed to broader European technological advancement. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized understanding of Avar settlement patterns and demographic organization through systematic survey methods that reveal landscape-scale patterns invisible to traditional excavation approaches. Aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imagery have identified thousands of previously unknown Avar sites throughout Central Europe, demonstrating population densities and territorial organization that exceeded earlier estimates. These discoveries have forced scholars to revise their understanding of Avar demographic impact and territorial administration, while revealing the sophisticated planning that characterized their settlement strategies. The application of scientific analytical techniques to Avar archaeological materials has provided unprecedented insights into craft production, trade networks, and technological capabilities. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, neutron activation analysis, and other compositional studies have traced the sources of raw materials used in Avar metalwork, revealing trade connections that extended from Scandinavia to Central Asia. These analyses demonstrate that Avar craftsmen had access to materials and technical knowledge from across the known world, enabling them to create synthetic traditions that combine the best elements from multiple cultural sources. Isotope analysis of human and animal remains from Avar sites has provided crucial evidence for understanding migration patterns, dietary practices, and social organization within the Confederation. Strontium isotope ratios in tooth enamel reveal individual mobility patterns that document the extensive population movements that characterized Avar territorial expansion and administrative practices. These studies have confirmed historical accounts of forced population relocations while revealing voluntary migration patterns that contributed to cultural synthesis throughout Avar territories. The contemporary relevance of Avar history in modern Central European national narratives reflects complex relationships between historical scholarship and political identity formation. Hungarian national identity has traditionally incorporated Avar heritage as a foundational element that provides historical legitimacy for Magyar territorial claims and cultural distinctiveness. This perspective emphasizes continuities between Avar and Hungarian material culture, settlement patterns, and political traditions, while minimizing the extent of cultural disruption that occurred during the Carolingian conquest period. Austrian historical consciousness has generally viewed the Avars as external invaders whose defeat by Charlemagne represented a crucial step in establishing Christian civilization in Central Europe. This interpretation, rooted in Carolingian historical sources and reinforced by Habsburg imperial ideology, portrays Avar rule as a temporary interruption of European cultural development, rather than a significant contribution to regional civilization. Contemporary Austrian scholarship has begun to reassess this perspective, recognizing Avar contributions to technological development and cultural synthesis, while maintaining emphasis on Carolingian achievements in establishing lasting political institutions. Slovak national memory incorporates Avar heritage as evidence for the deep historical roots of Slavic civilization in the Carpathian Basin, emphasizing the role of Slavic populations in maintaining cultural continuity despite political changes. This perspective highlights archaeological evidence for Slavic cultural persistence under Avar rule, while arguing that the Great Moravian Empire represented the culmination of cultural developments that began during the Avar period. Slovak historians like Dusan Trestik and Jan Steinhubel have demonstrated that Slavic populations under Avar rule developed distinctive political institutions and cultural traditions that provided foundations for subsequent state formation. The integration of Avar history into broader European historical narratives has required scholars to move beyond nationalist frameworks towards more sophisticated understandings of cultural interaction and institutional development. The recognition that early medieval Europe was characterized by complex processes of ethnogenesis, cultural synthesis, and institutional innovation has led to renewed appreciation for the Avar role in facilitating these transformations. Rather than viewing the Avars as simply another nomadic confederation that temporarily disrupted European development, contemporary scholarship recognizes their crucial contributions to the cultural and technological foundations of medieval European civilization. The preservation and interpretation of Avar archaeological sites has become a significant focus for cultural heritage management throughout Central Europe, with major excavations at sites like the Ring Fortress attracting international scholarly attention and public interest. Museums in Hungary, Austria and Slovakia have developed extensive Avar collections that demonstrate the sophistication of their material culture while educating public audiences about their historical significance. These institutional efforts have contributed to broader recognition of Avar contributions to European cultural development, while fostering international scholarly collaboration in investigating their legacy. The digital humanities revolution has created new opportunities for synthesizing the vast quantities of archaeological data, generated by decades of Avar research. Database projects that compile information from thousands of burial sites, settlement excavations, and artifact studies are revealing patterns that were invisible to earlier generations of scholars working with limited data sets. Geographic information systems that map the distribution of artifact types, burial practices, and settlement patterns across space and time are providing unprecedented insights into Avar territorial organization and cultural development. The application of network analysis techniques to Avar archaeological data has revealed the sophisticated communication and trade systems that connected their territories with regions throughout Europe and beyond. These studies demonstrate that Avar territories served as crucial nodes in networks that facilitated the transmission of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices across vast distances. The recognition of these network effects has led to fundamental reassessments of Avar historical significance, emphasizing their role as cultural mediators rather than simply military conquerors. Contemporary climate research has provided new context for understanding Avar adaptation strategies and their ultimate vulnerability to changing environmental conditions. Paleoclimatic data indicates that the Avar period coincided with generally favourable climatic conditions that supported agricultural productivity and population growth throughout Central Europe. However, the cooling trend that began in the late 8th century may have contributed to agricultural stress that undermined the economic foundations of Avar power, while strengthening the relative advantages of their sedentary neighbours who possessed more diversified economic systems. The study of Avar contributions to medieval European development continues to reveal new dimensions of their historical significance as scholars apply innovative analytical techniques to growing archaeological data sets. The recognition that their confederation represented a crucial phase in the transformation of post-Roman Europe has led to fundamental reassessments of early medieval history that emphasize cultural synthesis and institutional innovation rather than simple conquest and replacement narratives. The Avar legacy, preserved in the genetic heritage of Central European populations, the technological innovations that shaped medieval warfare and agriculture, and the institutional traditions that influenced Slavic state formation, demonstrates that their impact on European civilization extended far beyond their 2.5 centuries of political dominance. The Pannonian Avars ultimately represent one of history's most successful examples of nomadic adaptation to sedentary environments, creating a sophisticated confederation that synthesized diverse cultural traditions while maintaining effective military and administrative control over vast territories. Their legacy challenges traditional narratives of European development that emphasize the primacy of Roman, Byzantine, and Frankish contributions while minimizing the significance of steppe nomadic influences. As archaeological research continues to reveal new evidence for their technological innovations, cultural achievements, and lasting influence on European civilization, the Avars emerge not as barbarian destroyers of classical civilization, but as crucial contributors to the cultural synthesis that created medieval Europe.